All right, everybody. We're in the Community Development Standing Committee meeting for March 6, 2018. Welcome everybody to the traditional territory of Squamish Nation. We have an amended agenda in front of us. I'll entertain a motion to move the agenda. Moved by Councillor Kent, seconded by Mayor Heisman.
The amendment is just your order.
Oh. Yes, just the order. No actual change in the items. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Next up on the agenda, we have the minutes from our February meeting. Are there any errors or omissions in the minutes from our last meeting? Seeing none, I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes. Moved by Councillor Ray, seconded by Councillor Kent. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Okay, so first up on the order of business in the revised agenda, we have opportunities for car sharing in Squamish. I'll turn it over to our district staff.
Good afternoon. I'm Dora Gunn, a sustainability coordinator with the District of Squamish. And I'm here today to discuss an opportunity for bringing car sharing to the District of Squamish. So a brief introduction to car sharing, including some terminology, just so we're all on the same page. So car sharing is a type of vehicle rental. It's for the short-term use of the vehicle. It's different than ride sharing, which is carpool, vanpool, or real-time ride sharing using an app like Papa Ride. And different again is Uber or Lyft, which is called ride hailing. So 3 different types of sharing. Car sharing can be one-way or two-way. Two-way car sharing, the vehicle has a designated parking spot. The person uses the vehicle and then returns it to that parking spot at the end of the trip. With one-way car sharing, a user finds a vehicle with an app, can use the vehicle for a one-way trip, and then drop it off in a new location. Two-way car sharing doesn't work so well for commuting because you pay by the hour, so you would pay for the whole day, but only use the vehicle at either end. One-way car sharing can work for commuting if it's within the area of the one-way car share. However, one-way car sharing only works in a dense urban area like the city of Vancouver. The benefits of car sharing are that they can contribute to what's known as a car-light lifestyle, where people can reduce the number of personal vehicles they own from 2 down to 1, or even from 1 down to 0. It encourages the travel by other modes of transportation, and also can reduce pressure on parking spaces. Feel free to interrupt questions. So in Squamish, the potential for car sharing, we're not a priority market for car sharing due to our small size and relatively low density. So here only two-way car sharing would be viable. Staff did contact the 4 car share companies that operate down in Vancouver. 2 of them are one-way car shares and 2 of them are two-way car shares. And only Modo is interested in working with us. And this is only if we can provide the cost of the 2 first vehicles for the car share, provide dedicated parking spots, and also the district would need to lead by example by becoming a business member in the car share. And this would mean that employees at Municipal Hall, so downtown, would use the motor vehicle only if a fleet vehicle was not available. So there's been some developers that have agreed to support car sharing in Squamish. In particular, Waterfront Landing received their Phase 1 development permit on December 19th, which included a community amenity contribution for the equivalent of 2 car share vehicles. The Scott Crescent development also has a community amenity contribution in the last phase of their development for 3 car share vehicles, but this may be some years away. In any case, the funds would transfer from the developer directly to the car share organization and not through the district. So the Modo proposal for Squamish is to have the car share located downtown. There'd be 2 vehicles initially, followed by a third a year later. And these would be in a triangle configuration with at least 1 vehicle near Municipal Hall. And they would have designated parking spaces with a Modo sign, like that one in the picture. Using funds from Waterfront Landing, Modo would purchase the first 2 vehicles and would operate and maintain the vehicles. If the car share was successful, then Modo would purchase the third vehicle on their own If the car share was less successful, then the district could choose to look for another developer contribution to continue the car share. There has been some discussion about the types of vehicles. This is not set in stone at this time, but we've been discussing a Honda Fit and a RAV4 hybrid to provide a bit of diversity of vehicles, but still considering fuel efficiency. So members would use an app to reserve a vehicle. They could use any Modo vehicle, those in Squamish and elsewhere. So once you're a member of Modo, you can use them anywhere. Timing for implementing this, if it was to go ahead, hasn't been determined yet. Modo suggests that spring or summer is a good time to start a new car share, just because people are out and about more than in the winter. They haven't confirmed that they could do it for 2018, but it would either be 2018 or 2019. And if it was successful in the downtown area, then Modo has expressed interest in the Quest University area as well. So moving on now to district participation in car share. So the district could become a business member. This would be just for staff at Municipal Hall and only for local trips. If staff need to take trips further away, they could use a fleet vehicle, and then staff that remain at Municipal Hall could use the Modo vehicles if the fleet vehicle is gone. The vehicle use priority for staff would be, first of all, they would use a fleet vehicle. If that's not available, they would use a car share vehicle, and if that's not available, then they would use a personal vehicle. The benefits of district participation are to support the establishment of the car share. It's not a that it's going to be successful here in Squamish, and so this would really help. Can also delay purchase of new fleet vehicles, so as if staff levels change, sometimes new fleet vehicles are needed, but having car share available can put that off. It reduces the need of employees to use their own personal vehicles for work use. It also reduces the need for employees to drive to work if they think they're going to have to use their own personal vehicle for work. And employees can use Modo vehicles elsewhere. So for example, if there was a conference in Vancouver, a number of employees traveled down to that conference in a car together, and one of them needed to go and do a separate errand, they could use a Modo vehicle for that. However, the business, so any employees who registered as part of the business membership, they can't use Modo for personal use unless they have their own personal membership as well. So this would just be for business. So in the future, outside of this initial car share, the district could support expansion of car sharing in Squamish. The developers could contribute to vehicles, memberships, or parking. This is done in other municipalities in BC. So I think vehicles are fairly straightforward. With memberships, for Modo, you can buy a lifetime membership for $500, which can be attached to a unit rather than a person. And then the occupant of that unit doesn't have to pay anything to start using Modo vehicles, they just have to pay the hourly fee. So if they pass that hurdle, it makes them much more likely to use the car share. And then parking, so new developments can include specific parking stalls just for car share. These can have statutory right-of-ways put on them so that they're always set aside for car share vehicles. So staff are proposing to develop policy guidance on moving forward with encouraging car share use in Squamish. The guidance would include minimum contributions from developers to receive parking variances, the ratio of parking stalls to the contribution, the acceptable types of car sharing organizations, construction standards for parking, and the steps that the developer, car share organization, and the district would have to follow. And the developer wouldn't be required to work with Modo, so if other options were available to them, as long as they met that criteria, then they could choose which car share organization to work with. Budget implications. So in this case, to start the car share, the initial capital costs are being provided by BOSA, Waterfront Landing. For the district to participate, there's a one-time startup fee, which is a $250 security deposit, which is refundable if we were to terminate our business membership, plus a $10 registration fee per driver. This works out to $970 for the employees at Municipal Hall. And then there would be the hourly cost to use the vehicles, which is $8.75. The initial costs can be provided from the engineering and planning travel budgets, and then the hourly costs would be the responsibility of each department at Municipal Hall. and hear the recommendations from my report.
All right, thank you. Questions, comments? Councillor Race.
Thank you. So if there were 2 or 3 in the downtown area, which I think is what the report recommends, or 2 or 3 locations, if we had one, for example, just on 2nd Avenue outside City Hall, there's no guarantee that it's always available for City Hall, as we're competing with other people in the community who are also using it. Can you book these? Or
Yes.
You can?
Yeah.
So if you knew you were going to need it, you could reserve it sometime ahead of time, day before or something like that?
Yes, that's right.
Councillor Chappelle.
Why Moto over Evo or the other car share companies? And did we look at Turo? As far as just, if we're looking at car share, Turo is a new one step beyond, but where you can have personal vehicles for cheap too, that are just locally owned vehicles that aren't being used. That's the same thing as a car share, but
So I'm not familiar with Turo, so I can't speak to that.
Yeah.
But
It's in
when
Squamish.
It's in Squamish.
yeah, there's 104 cars that you can share in Squamish
Okay.
from Turo. And it's Simon Fraser University initiative.
Okay, I can look into that. Why Moto over the other car share companies is only because for sure the 2 one-way car share companies are not interested in Squamish. And the other 2-way car share company didn't respond to all the emails, repeated efforts from these. Yeah.
What happens if the car gets taken to Vancouver and somebody gets a ride back?
Uh,
Gets left in the Moto spot down there because Moto's down in Vancouver.
Moto has policy for all those types of situations.
So they all have to come back.
I don't know what it is, but yeah, you have to bring the vehicle back, and if you don't, then you're violating.
So
your
it's a point to
contract.
point.
So Moto has to return to the initial, yeah.
And just on the Turo, I believe Turo is kind of more like Airbnb, and so it's personal vehicles, and you can share your personal vehicle. There's no real barrier to that, and as you say, there's some available in Squamish. Bit of a different model than the Moto, or similar car share, and there's no guaranteed parking space. There's no developer contribution. So I wouldn't say that they're competing. We wouldn't choose Turo over Moto. They both can exist in the same ecosystem. But I don't think there's a role for the district in promoting the Turo model, whereas a more traditional car share, if there is such a thing, they're only a few years old, there is a role for us in sort of booting up or bootstrapping a car share opportunity in our town because of our lack of density.
I have another question.
Okay, I have Mayor Heinzman and then Councillor Pratt.
Yeah, I believe I read in the report, the $8.75 an hour, or whatever it is, also includes up to 250 kilometers. And so any kilometers above 250 would be just an added fee, I'm assuming.
Yes, I'm not sure the exact cost, but yes, that's right.
Yeah, and just a rough calculation there. For example, if we drove it up to Pemberton for an SLAB meeting, and you're at the meeting for 8 hours, it's still less than paying just per kilometer on a personal vehicle.
In that case, it might very well be, yeah, longer trips for sure.
Thanks.
Councillor Pratt.
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad that staff is joining this group. I've got friends on at a company in Vancouver, and they swear by it. So I'm glad we're doing that.
I had a question around whether or not we, as we're formulating our policy, especially in the beginning stages, whether or not we might want to, what are the merits of potentially saying that, Moto is our go-to instead of giving developers options? Because, it seems to me that if it's already a very difficult business case, and then if you get like 3 or 4 different players in there, then none of them might succeed. Whereas if we have Moto, which of course is a cooperative, it's a not-for-profit, might be better around. And I do like the lifetime membership attached to a unit, because I think sometimes for the Moto model, that's one of the barriers to entry is that upfront $500 membership fee for people, whereas the other car share services, you need a credit card or whatever, and that's it. So just for us to consider, both at staff and council level, how that might look, and maybe we just say to developers, you know, if you're getting a parking variance, you need to do a car share, and this is our provider, and here's the terms, and then the developer ultimately is still choosing, because, you know, if they don't want a variance, then they can just build the parking, but, you know, I'm just wondering. And also too, I still think too, it's good from a marketing perspective too, when you're selling a unit, to have that option, and, you know, kind of turnkey, and there'll be a parking spot right outside the building, you know, so anyway.
So my understanding as far as supporting just Moto is that we can't support an individual business. And in this case, they are a business. They're not a nonprofit charity. So they're a cooperative business, which is different than a nonprofit charity organization. So that's why.
Okay, so I have Councillor Elliott, Councillor Pryor, and Mayor Heitzman.
I still think we should explore a way to have a preferred vendor. I think that makes sense to me. The other question I have is, have we alerted like SD48 that we're contemplating this? Because they might be another business partner. So I guess my question is there sort of a marketing plan once we go ahead with this to try and make it successful? And my second question is, because we live in the corridor that requires snow tires from October to April, is that part of the maintenance?
Yes, that would be included, snow tires for sure. The marketing, we just have to be cautious because again, we can't support an individual business. So we can announce that car sharing is now available at Squamish, but carefully without supporting Moto specifically.
I guess I'm wondering if Moto is going to do any of that.
Yes, Moto definitely will, yes.
Okay, so Mayor Heitzman.
Yeah, I'd like to explore that thought, because I think in order for something like this to succeed, it likely needs more cars, and it needs some ability to create that critical mass, and if there's too many of them, they're all going to fail. And I push back a little bit on I understand we have legislation that makes it so we can't promote a business, but we can sign a contract with a business, and they become our provider of pencils. You know, I don't see why we can't frame this in the same way. Because I think Jason's right. I think the potential for this to fail, if it gets too diluted, is challenging. I think there's a ride pairing and all that sort of thing that's going to happen anyway. But if there's a mechanism that we can create a preferred provider, I think that's worth exploring. I don't expect you to have the answer now, but I think there's a way we may be able to do that. I think Karen has a good point about partnerships, and I think Quest there may be a mechanism whereby Quest, with the development that's happening maybe around Quest, can get in with a car sooner rather than later, because I actually think we're really successful up there. Mm-hmm. So we may want to explore we may not purchase the car, but maybe there's another way that we can get a third car pretty soon in the process. School District 48 is another one. There may be other potential partners in this, because I think it's one of those things is if there's not a critical mass, then it's just not going to get the uptake it should. But if you have too many cars, of course, you're spending too much money anyway. But I think we should maybe tweak it a little bit.
We have,
Just to respond on the idea of a partnership, we can explore. We've been exploring quite a bit already with other municipalities and with the province on sort of what the rules are, but we can definitely work with our CFO to look at the idea of going out for an RFP, a transparent public process, and to sign a long-term, a 5-year agreement, whatever it's attached to, which would be agreement with whoever wins that. We just have to be agnostic on who that would be. Mm-hmm. That's a possibility we can explore.
And the only other factor that came in on that was that the proposal from Moto was that they wanted us to purchase shares. And we are restricted under the law to purchase shares in that business. So that was one of the initial concerns as well. And the ministry did confirm that they absolutely considered this to be a business, not a nonprofit. And that's one of the reasons we've kind of tried to recreate this into something that fits within legislation.
okay, I have Councillor Chappelle and then Councillor Race.
Thanks. So maintenance will all be like cleaning the cars on a daily basis is all done by Moto? they have somebody up here, even with just 2 cars, that can
They'll contract with somebody up here.
to daily check, so every time the car comes back, and that's all paid for by Modo.
Yes, I'm not sure if it's daily. They have a maintenance plan that they implement with all their vehicles, and these Squamish cars will be the same.
Okay, and they're all in municipal parking spots for,
They will be in parking spots on road right-of-ways that we designate most likely.
so,
Councillor Rice.
Yeah, thank you. Just who actually owns the car? I understand the developer puts the cash up, but who owns it and what happens when it wears out? Who replaces it?
So Modo owns the vehicle, and it's up to them, it's their car share, their organization. If they want to continue car sharing, then they'll replace the vehicle themselves from that point forward.
So,
This initial contribution is just to get it going faster than it would otherwise happen. I mean, as Squamish grows and densifies, inevitably some car shares would probably be interested in coming to town, but this kind of kickstarts the process. But after that, yes, Modo owns them.
okay. So I'll just make a quick comment. I mean, I think this is, obviously there's going to be some hiccups going along because we're kind of breaking trail a little bit in Squamish, but I think this is certainly a good start, and especially when we have the development community sort of paying the upfront costs of it, which is a bonus for this particular economic cycle. So I absolutely support this. I think the idea of a preferred provider, I think, is worth following up. We obviously have some restraints legislation-wise, but I think if we can frame it somehow, even to the point of a partnership agreement or something like that, partnering agreement, that this would be a worthwhile thing to do, because we will suffer from lack of critical mass, there's no question. And competition, I think, is at least at the foreseeable future, is one thing that's going to hurt this. So.
one thing I want to add is making sure that they have child seats. And because there was an issue with that, I'm not sure how that happens, but parents with babies that have to carry their car seats to the car shares have issues. So if there's,
My understanding is that it's not possible for them to provide the car seats. There's a liability issue,
really,
unfortunately, especially in Squamish with so many
Yep.
families. But
Barrier.
unfortunately, that is the reality.
All right, well, good discussion. Looks like we're on time, and thanks, Smith.
Yeah, I'm going to put the motion forward. As per there, but add, and that staff explore the possibility of creating a preferred provider in the future.
Good. All right, we got seconded by Councillor Rice. Any further discussion? All right, all those in favor? Opposed? Motion carries.
And just post-motion comment, and just exploring the idea of these other partnerships that may quest and see the school district.
can we just have something in there? I'm worried about, I totally get preferred provider. But I also want it to be flexible enough that if things change with the provider or another provider can provide a better deal and change out our cars, that it be flexible enough to open up with not a closed contract or with a preferred, like it, yeah. I worry about getting locked into contracts with single companies and then other companies, newer companies coming along that may provide better services.
All right, something to consider. All right, I think we're good with that item. Thank you very much, staff. All right, next up on our agenda, we'll invite our development planning staff for Cheekeye River development.
Chair, through you, if I may.
Yes.
Just as introduction to the presentation today on Cheekeye River development. For clarification for council and the public's benefit, the objective of the presentation, there are a couple. The first is just a refresher for council and the public on the development and where it's at to date. Then there'll be a presentation on the potential ways of funding the operation, maintenance, and repair and capital repair of the mitigation barrier. Our CFO, Christine, will weigh in on that as well. At this point, we're not asking council to make a decision on that. It's more for information. The information we have is still pretty conceptual. And then the last part of the presentation will be about the current community amenity contribution package that the developer is proposing. And right now on the agenda planner, 2 to 3 weeks from now, we have the report coming back to council in a more formal way around moving forward to a public hearing. Should council be comfortable with the information we have today.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Good afternoon. My name is Velaniskis, Director of Community Planning. And so I'm just going to quickly go over with a brief refresher over what's actually proposed. It's been a few months since Council saw this development proposal in front of you. So it is an OCP and a zoning bylaw amendment. In terms of the OCP designations, part of the site is designated residential, part of it is designated restricted industrial, and there's some pockets of institutional designations and greenway corridors. So the proposal is to amend this purple hatched area to residential neighborhoods and to amend this greenway corridors pocket to residential neighborhoods, and then amend the crown land down here to greenway corridors and recreation. This little stretch right here also to greenway corridors and recreation. In terms of current zoning, again, part of the site is zoned RS1, which includes the BFI Park and the east side of Ross Road, and then part of the site is zoned resource. So these areas would have to be rezoned. In terms of proposed zoning, this is what the CD 82 zone looks like. It's this brown area. So anything in the brown area would be residential or neighborhood commercial, and the park area would be rezoned to a P3 zone, which is a park zone. Here's a quick look at the inside of the CD 82 zone. So we've got the single family areas, got the multifamily areas, and the neighborhood commercial area in the middle, as well as the park. Overall, it's 1,215 units. Approximately 40% of which is single family residential, and then the rest of it is multifamily. 25% of the multifamily, or 170 units, are purpose-built rental units, so that has changed since the original proposal. It is now 85 affordable housing units and 85 market rental. That's just a conceptual site plan of the layout of the internal strata roads and the park spaces. And I will hand it over to Gary Buxton now to go over the mitigation, operation and maintenance analysis.
Thank you, Chair, Council. So attached to the memo is this Cheekeye Fan Mitigations with Financial and Operational Considerations document. So we'll quickly walk through that. That's a proposal that they've submitted that's new to you, that outlines some supplementary information around the proposed design and operation of that, the debris barrier, financial costs for ongoing maintenance. It does talk about a diking authority. We don't consider that to be necessary or productive. I won't go through the report, the reasons we've outlined, but it's a separate authority. It's not needed, and frankly, it's only going to create more administrative overhead. We have a diking authority. There's no need to create another one. It then goes on to talk about a local area service. That's a geographically defined area, a specific tax within that area for a specific purpose under the charter. In this case, it's the collection and maintenance. It's the maintenance and collection of debris that collects behind the barrier. There's a monthly amount collected that is collected and stored in a financial reserve. That then is used to fund the ongoing maintenance. There's Every year there'll be small events to clean out, there'll be concrete and steel elements that need to be looked at, there'll be a road access to be maintained, there's vegetation management on the structure to be undertaken, all those sorts of things. So on an ongoing basis there's a bunch of work around that structure that needs to be done, and then occasionally there will be a larger event, some of which is trapped behind the barrier, some of which passes, but that amount of material will then need to be moved elsewhere. The local area service allows a method of collecting funds on an annual basis. We've had some preliminary discussions with the province. They say it's possible. Setting it up would require some attention to detail. The method of assessment within that local area service is something that we don't have an answer for you right now. Particularly through a multi-phase build-out and how the developers' lands get assessed, why that happens. If you're on a unit basis and you have land that has no units on, we need to resolve things like that. Typically, local area services require the assent of those affected. In this case, if it's restricted solely to the lands that are part of this development, that's not going to be very difficult. The developer's going to consent, or this thing goes nowhere. If we wanted to expand the local area service to the remainder of Brackendale, and frankly, if all the units were built, about 40% of the units are existing units and 60% are new, or is it the other way around?
40%.
Yeah. In terms of the ratio of existing versus new units. Maybe it's 40% already exists, 60% would be new. So if we wanted to expand it, that's when it's going to get a little bit more interesting, because we're going to need the assent of those that are in existing dwellings on existing properties. That's going to be a different political and administrative hurdle to overcome. Once established, however, we can adjust the rates up or down to, if we need to collect more money, great. If we need to collect less money, we can ramp it down. The alternative to this would be to include these operations and maintenance costs into general taxation, much the way that we do with every other or most other hazards in the community. We don't typically assign hazards to particular areas. However, the local area service in this instance offers an opportunity of being able to collect funds that may or may not meet the amounts that we need, as we'll see later on. We've evaluated in a number of scenarios up to $300 to $700 per year per household, per home. At the lower range, it's probably not that consequential. If you're at 700 or more, then it's getting quite significant if you're factoring that on top of rent or mortgage payments, possibly strata fees as well. So, I mean, some of those amounts, if they work, that's great. Some of those amounts, they're going to be a substantive burden potentially on property owners, should we get to that point. Okay, so the financial modelling, you'll notice a number of scenarios that the developer has provided and that we've subsequently done some of our own. The developer's models assume operations and maintenance expenses of about $150,000, including $100,000 of an insurance amount, and I will let the applicant speak to any insurance questions. $7 per cube to remove debris, and inflation rates, as you can see on the screen, 1.5% to 2%. So the scenarios that the developers provided, if there are no debris events, if we're lucky, we're unlikely to be that lucky, but you can see the dotted lines are the amounts that you need to hold for a 200-year event, 500-year event, and a 2,500-year event based on a specified amount of material times $7 per cubic metre. So you can see the $300 fee doesn't pass muster. The $500 and the $700 do result in substantial reserves being built. If you want to go to the next one.
Oh, I think we have some
Yeah.
questions. Oh, okay.
I'm trying to read the
You're okay, right? Are you okay? We're good? Okay. we're all
Okay.
waiting.
So the next one assumes that, and that's why you see these sort of shark's fin, is assuming that there are mid-sized events through the duration. Unfortunately, you can't see the top line very well. But again, one of the scenarios doesn't ever reach the point of being a sustainable reserve. The other one struggles, and the other one's fairly robust at $700. The next one is assuming mid-flow events and 10% increase in local service area fees. And again, one of the scenarios isn't going to help us. The second one appears to be useful, and the third one again, you end up with a robust reserve. I mean, one of the things to keep in mind is that $110 million is a lot of money for a district the size of ours to hold. It's likely at some point, if we're on that scenario, that we would probably ramp the LSA fee down. I don't think if we've got let's say a 15 or let's say a $20 million cost to repair the barrier under a major event, that we need to hold $80 or $90 million. So, I mean, but for better or for worse, this is one of the scenarios if it pans out as intended with the assumptions. So those are the three scenarios that the developer provided. We ran 3 other models using a statistical approach. We worked with a consultant who's done some of this work. It's based on the likelihood events averaged over the 100-year time frame. We looked at a 20 cubic meter cost. We've experienced some of these costs to move gravel. I think the cost to move gravel from lot 69 to the vertical landfill expansion is close to that number. And we've adjusted interest and inflation rates in some instances. So you can see, if you, using the statistical approach, using everything else staying the same, 2 of the amounts, the 300 and the 500, don't get us to the point that we need to be at with a robust reserve. The 700 does. If you go to the next scenario, we've used that statistical approach again and adjusted some of the CPI numbers. And again, that's similar to the last one, other than the $700 reserve starts to fade at the end of the life cycle. And the last one, the statistical approach and using the $20 per cube, we don't ever get there. So these are the best numbers that you can develop and you're going to be able to develop with the information we have. To get good numbers on any of these scenarios, we're going to need a detailed design on the debris structure. So if we want to, in terms of, we have met with EMBC, and we had this meeting to discuss the issue of, it takes potentially decades to amass a reserve under an optimistic scenario, decades to amass the reserve necessary to clear out major events. The question being, what happens if we get a major event prior to that point in time? So we're short money essentially in this debris that needs moving. So we met on the 22nd with EMBC staff. The mayor was able to attend. So their existing recovery programs allow a 70-30 split, provincial, municipal, for recovery, and that's to essentially to get infrastructure back to being in a safe and robust condition. So it appears that that there is funding on that 70-30 basis. So if you want to just actually skip to the next slide, I'm going to come back to the conclusion. So what we ended up and where we're at with EMBC and the ask is that is the province willing to enter into some sort of understanding or as part of the Inspector of Dikes IOD approval that guarantees that that gap is closed, that gap can exist. So guarantee providing disaster financial assistance in the event that a large debris flow event impairs the functionality. So there's the volume stacked behind the dam or behind the barrier means that we're at risk from having another event that might create problems for us, create property and life risk. And the costs exceed the amount we have in the reserve and any insurance we may have, and such funds be made to cover all costs. So it's an aggressive ask, is that they essentially backstop any potential gap on the condition that we maintain the local service area fund, if we can get that to the point that we know it works, that we build that reserve in accordance with the local area, we maintain the adequate insurance, and that we conduct the routine maintenance of the debris barrier in accordance with any of the IOD approvals. I want to skip back to the... So, I mean, there's a good deal of uncertainty related to the local area service. If there are some optimistic scenarios, then it's possible that we can amass a large reserve. If the circumstances are different, it's not evident that we can do that. But it is possible that a local area could meet that financial need. Part of the issue is that the hazard and risk on the fans existing. It's not just related to this new development. There is existing development on the fan that will need protecting. So if this development doesn't proceed, that work will still need to be done. So we think there's some merit in pursuing this approach, getting a detailed design on the structure, so then we can know how much does it cost to build it, which we don't know. We have a guess. And it's not possible to make any of these scenarios that we've presented robust for council without that design. We need that design to be able to say it costs this much to maintain it, it's going to cost that much to do that, and we're going to need to charge this much per unit, per acre, however we want to set up the local area service. If we do, I said there is an option you can fund this through general taxation, and council needs to make that decision, not today, about philosophically how they want to fund managing risk in the community. The local area service offers an option for council, and going through this design and the math gets us to a point we can make an informed decision as to whether or not that's something that council wants to consider. So
I think
we've had some internal discussions, and if Ms. Matthews wants to add anything to them.
Well, I think staff has done an excellent job of outlining some of the concerns that I brought forward. We are exploring right now whether we could actually ensure that diking or that barrier. I do philosophically have some concerns with the approach to using a local service in this particular scenario, because it is more than just the 1,200 units being impacted by that. And really the ideal uses of a local area service are where you have a direct benefit relationship and the costs are well known, and you can formulate taxes within that perspective. So I'm concerned about that. I'm concerned about building a reserve for a what-if scenario. If you build a local area service, you must use the funds only for those properties. So if it got up to, say these optimistic ones panned out and you did get up to 10 and 20 and $30 million reserves, which I think are probably politically and practically maybe legal, but maybe difficult to deal with for the councils of the day. Even if you got up to that and then decided you didn't need it because we had other solutions at that point, you would have to find some way to deploy that cash back to that specific neighborhood. So from those perspectives, as a CFO looking at it and philosophically around best uses of LAS, I do sort of tend to favor more looking at this council deciding that we do need a barrier. You do want to make sure that that is a protection for that entire area, that we look at something more fulsome in terms of maintenance and ongoing concern around that. I would also question whether we would probably borrow for the replacement of a dike rather than building a reserve of such a large magnitude under normal scenarios. So those are probably just a couple key things. Other key concern for me is affordability. Council is very concerned about affordable housing, and as Mr. Buxton pointed out, putting anywhere from 300 to 700 on top of an average strata unit of 1,500 taxation is close to 30% plus increase in their taxation over what other properties are paying there. So that should also weigh into council's decision about how to approach this in the future. I'll leave it there. I'm happy to answer any questions about the structures, but those are some of my key concerns.
Okay, well, we have a good list.
Sorry, Chair.
Yeah, was there one more thing?
Perhaps we can just, Jonas was going to go through the CAC issues and then we'll be done and I'll answer council's
Okay.
questions.
Okay, very quickly. So just a refresher on the CAC offer, and we're using the interim CAC policy because this development came in 2013, and we are working on an update to our CAC policy, but because it's gone through first, second reading and a public hearing, that's the approach we've taken. So if you use the interim CAC policy, the target amount is 7.4 million, and that includes recognition for the 85 affordable housing units and the 180 single-family lots that would be permitted under current zoning. So at public hearing, this is how the CAC proposal looked, and this is what the applicants proposed. It doesn't mean that all of these items meet our policy, but that's what the applicants proposed. So the mitigation barrier is in at 45 million. The Brackendale Farmers Institute Park at that time was proposed to have value of 14.7 million. Public access parks and greenways had assigned 6.5 million. And then there was the 1.5 million community amenity contribution and some smaller amounts for trail improvements. Plus there was a contribution towards affordable housing to be built on that site, and the district was gonna leverage that with provincial funding or other funding opportunities to maximize it. So overall, the applicant suggested that the value of their package is 72 million. Since that time, the applicant has revised the proposal. So some of the notable revisions are the values that were assigned to the Brackendale Farmers Institute Park. It's come down to 1.75 million, which is reasonable from the 14 million. And I will, in my next slide, explore why it is. The other notable change is in the previous proposal, there was 6.5 million for public access to parks and greenways. That's gone, and the affordable housing contribution has changed from a cash contribution for something that was going to be built on site to 85 purpose-built rental housing units secured under a housing agreement. The value we've assigned to that is 18 million, but it's really, rather than focusing on the value of those units, we're looking at what's the percentage of the overall units that we'd be getting in affordable housing, and that's 7%. So it is somewhere in between our old policy and the new policy, which would require 10% affordable housing units. And here's the aspects of the CC that would be eligible in our opinion. So the 1.75 cash value for the Brackendale Farmers Institute Park is a reasonable assessment. The 2017 BC assessment value for those properties was 4 million. And everything else is basically staying the same as proposed by the applicant. So the total cash value appears to be around 22 million if we take the value for 85 affordable housing units at 18 million, which basically represents the construction cost, not the land and not the soft cost, just the construction cost at about 200,000 per unit. The other notable change is that this proposal also now includes 85 units of market rental. So it's not part of the CUC policy, it's more of a rezoning consideration, but that is a welcome change to this proposal. That's it.
All right, Mayor Heinzman.
Yeah, can you remind me why the province doesn't just be the diking authority, like create their own authority, and under the act, they can, for example, the Pemberton Valley Diking District, completely separate entity, not run by any municipality or local government. It's a function of the provincial government, appointed by the province, board is appointed by the province, funded through the province. Why would we not just insist that the province be the diking authority for this? It protects the highway, it protects the substation. It's land that they've sold, the government has sold predominantly. They kind of just told us we had to be the diking authority, but why didn't we push back and say, no, you be the diking authority?
I'll let Gary answer that question.
Thanks. Mr. Ralston, Mr. Ralston's understanding of the Dyke Management Act is far greater than mine, so I don't know if you have I don't know the answer to that question, Mayor Heinzman, so.
Through the chair, my understanding is that that all dikes have to be owned and maintained by a local diking authority, not. So the province is the diking authority for all province or all dikes provincial-wide, but each dike has a local authority that owns and maintains it. And so my understanding is that for a new dike to be constructed, it requires a local diking authority to maintain.
True, but the local governments do not have to be the governing body of a local diking authority. It can be its own appointed authority from the province.
I can't
Under
speak,
the Act.
Okay, I can't speak to that. Just my understanding in discussions with the provinces, their expectation would be that the district owns and maintains it. If there are alternatives to that, I'm not aware of them, and the province didn't put those forward as options.
No, I can see why the province wouldn't want to be the diking authority. That's the hesitation we're having. There's a jeopardy in that, obviously. But maybe it's something we go back to the province and say, we think this is a perfect candidate for a local diking authority, but it's managed through the province. I can read the definition under the Act if you'd like, but it doesn't have to be municipality. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. It can be appointed through the province. The board would be appointed to the province. Their authority would be granted to them by the province. They would have the ability to create the district, receive the monies, do what's needed, and fundamentally it's a product of the province, so the province has to backstop regardless, in theory. So I just think it's worth exploring because I think this is a particularly unique circumstance. Not only is it protecting provincial assets, it's protecting First Nations reserves. It's obviously protecting some existing community as well, so there may be part of that existing community that becomes part of this particular local diking authority. But I think that would answer a lot of our concerns. I've got other questions too, more technical questions. I'm glad to see the proponents brought their science dude.
We'll do one tour around the
Yeah.
others. Councilor Rice.
Thank you. So I was going to start, I think one of our first decisions is what share, if any, the general taxation of the community as a whole plays in the ongoing maintenance of this structure. And when I read the report, and coincidentally we have a similar issue coming up in the agenda tonight for the park, I thought if this was purely for this development, this barrier was purely for this development, and that was the only thing that was going to benefit from the development, then obviously the development ongoing should pay for that. But it's not, as we all know. It will significantly safeguard Brackendale as a whole, going down to, depending which study you look at, practically down to Garibaldi Way. And it will also enable additional future development in that area that, for different reasons, we've sort of put off to the side for other things, the airport being one example of it. So personally, I'm of the view that there should at the very least be a sharing. and whether it's 50/50, I think the development has a role to play ongoing. And local area charges, I understand, are a pain, but this is a significant event. They're a significant structure, and I think it's maybe worth making the effort for this. We can debate whether it's 50/50, 60/40, 70/30 or something like that, but I think we have to come to the point where we have to understand, because ultimately it's not the developer. I know we all like to squeeze the last drop of blood from the developer, but that's really not what's happening here. It's the people who will ultimately live in these properties that will pay this ongoing charge. And it's a matter of fairness, which I think should really be the foundation of these decisions. Is it fair to charge them for the whole of the cost of the ongoing maintenance for this thing when it's benefiting a large part of the community? It doesn't benefit all the community, but what does? I mean, I live at 650 feet or something above sea level, and I pay into a diking system. So if I get flooded, we're going to be worried about a lot more things than that. So I think, you know, generally speaking, as we look around for all the other things, the downtown dike and stuff like that, those are costs that are shared by the entire community. So I don't think we have to go to the point of creating a local area within just Brackendale. I think, to me, it's the development versus general taxation. I know there's the option of having a contract with the Strata Corporation, and for a variety of reasons, I don't think that's a good option. So I think it is the local area charge where it ends up in the tax roll. And then the question is, what percentage for that development versus what percentage for general taxation. The other aspect of that is what happens during the build-up. And so when I was trying to think this through on day one, and day one for me is the barrier has been built. So the maintenance costs are theoretically starting from that point. But at that point, really no housing has been built because the barrier has to come first. And so it's going to be some years before the full build out of that development. And who's actually paying into that for the share that might be assigned to that development. And I think that's the part the developer should cover. And on a declining balance, as more and more of these properties join the general tax scheme and start paying the development share into our reserve, then the developer's obligation can decrease to the point where the entire development is built out. Everybody on site, all the units, are paying not only their taxes, but they're also paying some proportion into this reserve. And at that point, the developer can walk away. So I think those are some philosophical issues we should consider. And it's kind of splitting the numbers in there, you know, because that's all or nothing, all the graphs and so forth. And if you took some middle path somewhere through there, what does that look like? And does the charge become reasonable? And can we cover maintenance in a reasonable way? It doesn't deal with the kind of the major disaster, and that to me is a separate issue, but just dealing with kind of the ongoing maintenance. I think that's maybe one of the first decisions we should kind of face is, should the general community be part of that discussion? Personally, I think it should. So I've got other things as well, but I'll step aside.
Okay, Councilor Frye.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it was a good report. It seems a lot clearer. But I noticed that you got $7 for cleaning the material out after an event, and $20 for cleaning the material out after an event. There's two different numbers in there, and I just wondered where they came from. And I also wondered if where do you take this stuff?
The $7 is a cost that the developer's experienced in terms of moving material. The $20 is a cost that we've experienced of moving material. So that's just a bracket. Those are two bookends. Where do you take it? As noted in the report, you need probably 50 or 60 acres. So we would need tenure, guaranteed tenure, somewhere close, because you do not want to move this potentially millions of cubes. You don't want to move it very far, so you're moving it somewhere on the fan. So the owner has access to land, so they've suggested that they can provide tenure of 50 acres that gives us a place to dump this stuff. So I don't know if that...
I just wanted to provide one clarification on the $7 per cubic meter. That was based on the developer looked at if you had a certain volume of material, they assumed that there would be 4 excavators and 4 trucks running, and basically loading up those excavators, a 40-minute round trip. So truck pulls up, it gets loaded with material, it drives to the site, it dumps it, it comes back. So 40-minute round trip in order to do that. And then basically looked at how long would it take, what are the unit rates of having a truck and an excavator, and that's where the $7 per cubic meter came from. And the $20 came from the district's experience with Lot 69 and the landfill, and also with the Ministry of Transportation. They've had, I believe they had an event that was about 50,000 cubic meters. My numbers are rough here, but about a 50,000 cubic meter event on the Charles Creek debris barrier just near Lions Bay, upstream of Highway 99, and it cost about $1 million to clean that out. I think this is in around just before 2010, and so it looked like their unit rate was somewhere around that $20 a cubic meter. Where the material is going to go, how long it takes to load it, is processing of the material required in order to do it, compaction, you need to buy land to dispose of it, you need to clear it, you need to do vegetation. There's a whole bunch of unanswered questions as to how that physically actually gets moved, and you're having to compact the material. So there's a lot of uncertainty in all of the costs that are presented at this point, and more work would need to be done to iron out those details and really get a better idea of the sediment removal cost.
And so has there been any kind of structural analysis of the material? Not yet.
I think through experience we know that it's going to be trees and silt and gravel and large boulders, so it's going to be an inconsistent material that would require some form of
It's
processing.
not necessarily good for fill.
Not without processing.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Schwab.
I had the same questions, if it could be monetized in any way after it was removed. And most of my points have been basically brought up, so there's no chance of, because it is just total debris. And I guess the other question I had is having another channel so that you don't have to, like the smaller events pass by, and building a different structure, not necessarily a giant wall that you have to clean out all the time, but a series of structures that actually filter out, naturally filter out, instead of, I mean, we keep thinking of this giant concrete structure that we have to dig out all the time. There's other barriers that have been built. And I know we need the massive barrier to actually stop the main event, or if there's a massive event. But for the smaller events and the cleaning out, why can't you just divert it so you don't have to clean it out all the time? Or build some other some different structures that filter and push the material in different areas.
Maybe Matthias can...
I can respond initially.
Unleash the engineers. Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Sure. So your question, if I may paraphrase, sorry, the name is Matthias Jakob. I work with UGC Engineering. Should introduce myself briefly. The question is, could a number of different structures be built in addition to, not in lieu of, but in addition to the large barrier that has been proposed?
Not necessarily structures, but diversions for smaller.
Yeah, so it's a very valid question, and we've looked at various options, and it's not like it's cast in stone the way it's the current thinking. Let's start from the back. With diversions, one of the key problems is risk transfer. So if you divert the debris into some areas of the fan, you have to think very, very carefully if you could make things possibly worse for existing ones, and legally, of course, that's a big no-no. Having said that, if there are portions of the fan that are not developed or not to be developed, could be sterilized one way or the other, then diversion into a harmless area is feasible. And coming from the European Alps, that is a very feasible strategy. The design philosophy there has been many times to give a certain portion of the alluvial fans to nature, where it can do its thing, and then there's a big separating dike, and on the other side, that's for development. The philosophy of filtering, as you mentioned, is also being practiced in Japan and Austria, Switzerland, France, and other nations, where you take the big stuff out at the very top, and then you let some through, and then you then filter it some more, and then strain it some more, and so on. The Austrians call it a functional chain. It is possible, and just to make it clear, the current thinking is to allow some debris to pass through anyway, for a number of reasons. A, to have the structures be some degree self-cleaning, but B, also to maintain the stream health, in quotes, downstream. And with stream health, I'm referring to if you starve the system, the lower Cheekeye River on the fan of sediment, it will tend to cut down in size, and that could create bank stability issues and other issues. There's also a certain amount of sediment that Cheekeye River receives from Cheekeye River, and it's in some sort of balance, and certain fish like certain gravels. So cutting it off would be undesirable. So yeah, in short, there's a number of options that can still be entertained. However, some large structure would be needed, and we have topographically, we're very fortuitous that we have this large basin which is out of sight and allows that large amount of storage. In many other fens in the province, you would not have that luxury.
Thank you, that was well answered.
That's all right.
Thanks. So I'm glad that everyone took the time to do this work, because it really shows just by tweaking the numbers a little bit, we end up with something that's not sustainable, or doesn't really help us that much. And also, I don't think it's feasible to charge that local service area to the rental or affordable rental. So there's like 165 units there that, or 60 units that shouldn't pay that. But I think they're included in this, the assumption we do. So I guess my questions are more around the insurance piece of this. And in the same way that we insure our homes and other municipal assets, why wouldn't we just insure this as an asset for its replacement cost and cleanup if there was a major debris? And then all we would have to fund through a local service area and distribution across the district is insurance and the annual maintenance fee. But then we wouldn't be collecting a huge reserve that we wouldn't be using, but we would be covered in the event of a large event. So I guess I'm wondering, like, would MIA cover something like this?
My understanding is, Ms. Matthews can confirm this, dikes are typically uninsurable.
So through the chair, we're just in the preliminary process of exploring with our own insurance providers whether they would insure this barrier. So right now we only have the developer's information and intel on that. It's been our experience that most municipal infrastructure of this nature, like dikes and sometimes dams, are not insurable. So that's what we're following up currently to see if we could insure it or not. But I believe the developer has outlined some options where they believe it is insurable. So I'd have to refer to them right now.
Through the chair. So we've been working with Lloyd's at London, who've put out to various names, Swiss Re being most likely the main holder of the insurance, but they are analyzing the current debris flows. They're working with BGC to understand the flows, the magnitudes, the time frame over where this insurance would take place. We've had a sort of verbal front-end conversation with them of what, the amount of 50 million being the limit, and a principal being estimated at, 50,000 annually. 50,000 annually. And so in our modeling, we've said that would be at 100,000, just because there's so many unknowns right now that we don't know where this thing will actually land. So we don't have a written commitment from them, but they are exploring it, and there's an appetite to ensure the removal of the debris and the structure. So we're continuing those conversations, and what they will most likely need is more design work in order to fine-tune that. So all the modeling that we've looked at you guys are paying for insurance, but you're not ever, cashing in on the insurance. You guys are effectively becoming self-insuring over time. And that's the approach that we've taken. So the insurance is your backstop, and until you don't want it anymore. And maybe that's because you have the NBC backing you, or it's because your funds are so high that you don't want to self-insure through Swiss Re and a conglomerate of names.
Can I just ask a follow-up question? Christine, you mentioned that if we did have major work to do after a significant event, that we would borrow. But we have a borrowing limit as a sort of in our financial plan, and wouldn't we exceed that or severely constrain our ability to borrow for other projects in the district over that amount of time?
Through the chair, that is certainly a consideration as to whether or not we'd exceed limits, and we often do use reserves to deal with or assist with replacements. But for an asset of such a major magnitude, if we couldn't get there, normally we would consider borrowing for such a major asset like a wastewater treatment plant or something of a significant value. We would normally look to borrowing and spread that debt service over a longer period of time with the now benefiting properties. So my understanding is to replace would be about $15 million. Is that, am I understanding that correctly?
Replacement. I don't think we have a number to say it's going to cost this much to do
We don't know how
replace
much
yet.
it's going to be.
I think she's talking about the removal of material.
The removal, yeah, well, that's simply a function of is it 7 or 20 a cube. I think it goes from 14 to 44 million, the brackets of those numbers.
So one of the struggles we have obviously right now is we don't have the information. They haven't done detailed design, so we don't know what we would be dealing with. We haven't had an opportunity to explore significantly with MIA, but MIA covers us from a liability perspective generally. So, but right now we're not using their property insurance, we're using
Councillor Kent.
And if it were to fall onto the district for the local area service, have we considered what administration costs would be like, and would we bear those? And if so, how would we pay for that? Would it be through the developer, or would it be through taxation? Because obviously I think it's a lot to burden finance, Ms. Matthews, with, so would we have to hire extra people on to be able to handle that, and how would that be covered?
through the chair, depending on the nature of the complication of the local area service, it could definitely cause some annual upkeep and maintenance. I definitely have some concerns with the parcel tax approach for a number of reasons, the key one being one that Councillor Race outlined, because if parcels say they don't subdivide right away, or there's not that many parcels, then you're tagged to that, and I'm not sure that that really is a good representation of each property's cost in the game, or skin in the game. There's definitely concerns for me if we were to enter into numerous local area services. It definitely adds stresses around, we have to capture those costs, and if we, particularly with the parcel tax, if we want to modify that parcel tax each year, there is a fairly robust process that goes on around that administratively that we have to do. So if we're in favor, we can also do a local area service based on assessment value and tax it the same as a property tax valuation. That would tend to be my preference if we're going to do that. That also deals with it from an assessment dollar perspective and allows us to hit that person holding the big one parcel more significantly, potentially.
Okay, before we go around the next round, I'll just chime in and say that I go in the direction that Councillor Race was going in terms of sort of like a mixed share, and thinking, of course, that potentially once the barrier is built, there's a whole bunch of other land that could open up and also contribute to that local area service tax as well. But I'm also curious about how the other debris flow barriers along the corridor are managed currently, and if it is municipalities like the one that was mentioned in Lions Bay, I suspect that it's not Lions Bay managing that. So, but anyway, knowing what the flavor of all of those are, it sounds like there's 3 or 4 other examples, and Britannia Beach, I believe there's one there as well. Just kind of knowing that, that kind of thing. So it could be wrong, but if there are other examples, that would be great. looking forward to, future, you guys don't have to answer now. Mayor Heinz.
Yeah, so one of the things that came up quite a bit with EMBC at the last meeting, there seemed to be some clarity about emergency response. If there's an event and there's an emergency, there's 100% funding to do X, Y, Z. I think some of the problem is the Diking Act was written really, the flooding part of it, of EMBC's policies, is really written about dikes protecting from coastal and rivers. And it really doesn't contemplate these types of structures as it was created. So they're kind of don't have a place to put these, so they've put them in the Diking Act and they've put them in the purview of the Inspector of Dikes, and EMBC treats them like a flooding event because there's water in the slurry. Couldn't really figure out what their logic was. Anyway, that's how they parceled them in those different things. So one of the things that came up was, we don't, and this is where maybe Matthias can help us out. The structure is designed to let some stuff go through, but at a certain volume, it'll start holding debris back, and we may not want to, from a financial point of view or from a practicality point of view, go in and dig out every time there's an event that adds debris. Let's call it a swimming pool, so it fills up the swimming pool a little bit, except there's no water in it, but you know what I mean. And they're small events, so they just sort of accumulate, and at some point, it's going to accumulate to the point where the risk isn't tolerable anymore. That it slowly fills up, and so at some point it's going to, okay, the risk isn't tolerable anymore, and I don't know how much freeboard there is in the design, and maybe that we haven't gotten there yet, but if we just allow these events to build up, the EMBC seemed to be confused about whether they would come in and help out at all. The EMBC's regs are sort of like, if there's an event and a dike gets damaged, they'll put 70% in, the Diking Authority puts 30% in. But this is a cumulative thing as opposed to a specific damage thing. And they really didn't seem to have any good answers on that. So, and it's hard to understand because they don't really have examples of this kind of structure in BC or in very many places in the world. This is a magnitude bigger than Lions Bay or any of these other ones. And correct me if I'm saying something that's incorrect. So they really, and then every time any sort of actual volumetric numbers came out with regard to what an event could be, you could see NBC going, well, that's a lot. Oh my goodness, that's a lot. So these are numbers in magnitudes that they haven't had to deal with in these small structures like Lions Bay. So, and it's hard to understand, and we've had a few events in the last little while. Debris has gotten down to the confluence of the Cheekamus a couple times in the last decade. So we know that these bigger events or I guess these are even still small events relatively speaking, they can happen fairly frequently. The medium-sized event, and it's all modeled, and every time you model something, it shows a different pattern of where something might go depending on, there's a question here somewhere, I'm just trying to set the context. I'm trying to understand, I mean, my estimation is they're likely going to have to rewrite some of the legislation that governs this stuff because they're trying to fit a square in a circle a little bit. Maybe from Matthias, I'm trying to understand the risk.
Mm-hmm.
And the likelihood of this building up, filling up the freeboard, filling up the pool until the risk isn't tolerable anymore and you have to go and dig it out. I think that scenario is quite feasible, or it could happen. And it looks like under the EMBC that they wouldn't cover any of those costs. So I don't know, I've just sort of babbled on there, but if you could help me out a little bit.
I have a pretty good idea of where the question goes.
Okay, good.
Yeah, so you made a good point that there is over time an accumulation of debris that would be invariably the case. Let's just say in the ideal case scenario, the 5-year and 10-year and 20-year event all march through harmlessly. Whether or not remains to be seen upon more detailed design. And let's say the 50-year event and the 100 and the 200 would largely be stopped by the barrier, with some proportion going through, but the idea being that it does not cause harm, particularly at the Cheekeye confluence. So this material, if accumulating, would not necessarily drive the risk over the unacceptable threshold, because as you mentioned, we would have some contingency, some freeboard built in. That freeboard could be built into the barrier itself, but it could also be in the form of multiple structures, with the barrier ultimately not being quite as high, and then another one or several downstream. Or possibly some diversions, if a part of it then can be designated to be suitable for that. Now, with this material that would accumulate behind the barrier, given that the current thinking is that it's an open slot barrier, even that material would by itself be reworked and re-entrained over time. Unless it accumulates in areas that are so at the flanks of the barriers that it doesn't get grasped. Even in those cases, there doesn't necessarily have to be the solution whereby the material gets excavated and driven somewhere. The material could also be gently pushed back into the creek. Where I grew up in southern Bavaria, behind certain structures, they actually dig it out and take it onto the other side of the structure and then dump it back in, because they want the replenishment of gravel for
But that costs money.
Stream health reasons. Yeah, that costs money. Now, if one takes, I'll just talk crude, a bulldozer and pushes it into the creek, of course it has to be done somewhat more sophisticated than I put it. That is probably a lot cheaper than putting it into trucks, driving it somewhere, and so on and so forth. So there's a bit of, it's just like a seesaw pattern. There's a lot of room to optimize how one would tackle that. But at some point, yes, the fill level, if you will, would exceed a threshold whereby then if a big debris flow were to come down, it would overwhelm the structure and so on, undoubtedly. And that, I mean, in the simplest way, somebody takes a spray can after our analysis and puts a line along the base of the, I'm not promoting that, but in the simplest way, right? In other words,
we understand that.
When you do the repeat surveys, be it with a total station or with some fancy remote sensing techniques, and you say, okay, this fill level has now been reached, now we are at a level where we need to remove the sediment either which way.
And I'm not sure EMBC would cover that.
Yeah, I don't know, but this threshold should and could be set. Yeah.
I want to address one of the mayor's questions, which is I think a bit of a crux issue. Is EMBC has said there needs to be a disaster in order for response or recovery to funds to become available, and so I think that is what we're looking to achieve some certainty with a memorandum of understanding is. What is going to be considered a disaster event? Is it a 1 in 20 year return period event? Is it 1 in 50? Is it 1 in 100? Where does that happen, and what proportion of funding would become available? And that's where I think we're lacking a lot of certainty right now. We're trying to seek that with a memorandum of understanding.
And that might inform our general operation and maintenance in terms of all the stuff that TS just talked about.
Yeah, that's the sort of getting back to the ask of EMBC. The bottom line is conduct routine maintenance. I think that's establishing the baseline to which we have to work, and beyond which is the threshold that something needs to happen, and that at that point in time EMBC needs to commit to stepping in. That's, I think, where we're trying to get with this, is to get them to commit to, between here and here, we'll use the local area service or taxation to keep that under control. It gets a foot above that level, we're phoning the EMBC and saying our reserve doesn't cover it, cut us a check, so to speak.
And if I may, I don't know whether that's the appropriate way to tackle it, but we could perhaps help EMBC to define what is a disaster by asking the question in a different way, by saying if there were no barrier, at what return period would there be damage? that you would consider that a disaster. And we could specify that because we've done the modeling for all return periods, and we can say at that return period, Highway 99 bridge gets destroyed. At that return period, you have the emulsion that runs towards Brecondale. At that return period, you take out the Fergies at the mouth of the Cheek, and so on and so forth, which undoubtedly, by anybody's definition, would be classified as a disaster.
Yeah, right, we talked about that too.
Okay, I have Councillor Race and then Councillor Shaw.
Yeah, just 2 quick points to start with. I mean, just the idea of a diking district separate from the municipality is an interesting thought. Pemberton, for example, has a separate diking distance, and I know that just because working in conveyancing, you always have to adjust for the diking fees. They tax properties separately from the municipality, but they tax the properties. And I don't know if the diking area and the municipal boundaries would be the same thing, or whether it's only a potential flood area. I don't know the details of that. There is a separate entity up there. In my first term, I know we kicked around the idea of forming our own diking authority for Squamish to separate out all the charges for diking and so forth that we were going to be facing, the capital charges. And at that time, the information that I received was it's kind of, there's pros and cons. In some ways, you're just duplicating a whole bunch of staff and infrastructure, etc. So, but it is an interesting possibility if it relieves us of the ultimate responsibility, because that continues to be my worry, is the disaster scenario. And I think it's possible, we're talking about an MOU with the province, it's possible to define what a disaster is, where they would step in. Now we're only dealing with 30% of the costs, and you can start running numbers accordingly with that. I've always thought in all of the presentations I've heard that the whole purpose of this maintenance would be to do a whole bunch of small maintenance jobs as opposed to one big maintenance job. So it would be happening on practically an annual basis. But there's a lot of engineering and things involved in that, and so I don't want to get too far into that. But I think to get the province involved, if we can pin the province down to a 70-30 split, then we only have to worry about the 30. If we can divine that and figure that out. And then also we just have to run our maintenance numbers. Where is the level? Because that's how often might we get there, and you'll kind of run the costs. And obviously going forward, we have to be able to adjust the charges to the development, the LAC charges and the district's contribution to it, if any, because $20 a meter today is probably not going to be the price 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 years from now. So I think that's all doable. Lions Bay is, we received a report a couple of years ago prepared by our staff that talked about Lions Bay having to put $1 million into their, the event we just heard about cleaning out their basin. Coincidentally, I was at a seminar with a counselor from Lions Bay just a few weeks after that. Lions Bay as a municipality, he told me Lions Bay as a municipality paid to have their water intakes cleared out, separate thing entirely. MOTI paid $1 million for the basin. So, because they were put in there in the first place to protect the highway in addition to the housing. So there are other examples, and I'm not aware, the only other one, I don't think there's any in the regional district. The only other one I'm aware of is possibly in the Fitzsimmons Creek in Whistler, and I'm not sure what exactly they've done to safeguard that. In Britannia, I do know those are historical dams, and what they're doing is decommissioning them. They're blowing them up and settling them down because they do allow stuff to build up and then just let go, and then it is a real problem. So that continues to be my worry, is the ultimate disaster where it's not $1 million, it's 20, 30, $40 million that would just overwhelm our budget. Whether we were borrowing or however we might try to raise the money to put this thing back in place. And I have limited confidence, to be frank, in insurance policy, because I've dealt with insurance policies. They have a lot of fine print, and so you have to be confident that you're within the fine print. And they would probably have a significant deductible, which is something that we would have to budget for. Because if they were stepping in, and it might be something like a $10 million deductible or something like that for a policy like this, where they're just covering about some significant number. So we'd have to be prepared for that number. And that's the budget going forward. But I think ultimately, because when you look at these graphs in the first 40, 50 years, there's a lot of potential for a shortfall. That's where we want the province in some form to step in. It can be reduced to 30%. If we can have insurance, budget for the district, then our risk as a municipality starts to shrink to the point where maybe we'll become comfortable with it. But at the moment, I'm still just a little bit worried about that particular thing.
Councillor Scott.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Race, that was excellent. And I always think about the cost to our community if we don't build the debris flow, and we always end up niggling about how we dig out some gravel behind the, and I appreciate the gravity of having the expense of digging out gravel on a regular basis, but the gravity to our community of not building a debris flow barrier, it should be, how do we get there with various models of expenses. And I would agree with Councillor Race that charging all of our community is protected from various different physical hazards, geophysical hazards, and we all pay for it. And whether we live in the Highlands, we benefit from our community being protected, whether it be having our doctor's offices protected or emergency structures protected. And to basically always comes down to, you know, how much do the excavators cost at the end of the day to maintain a debris flow, when we don't do the economic modeling of how much it would cost to rebuild our infrastructure if we don't have a debris flow. And I'm interested in seeing that balanced. I don't always want to see how much it costs to dig it out without seeing the expense of not digging it out. Because those are the two things we weigh here, is our infrastructure is going to be damaged, our housing is going to be damaged, and we're going to possibly lose lives, and especially in the First Nations communities. So, you know, loss of life compared to how much does 4 excavators, 3 excavators, do we have to dig it out once, twice, you know, 50 times? But really, this is an overdue debris flow that's coming down. It's over 200 years now, so we can expect it. And, you know, we had an event at the beginning of the winter where, you know, there was a rumbling up there and everybody looked up and was like, is this it? And those moments give our community anxiety. I wonder how much stress people have living with the threat of having a giant debris flow barrier come down into their community. So those are things to be, those are economic and healthcare costs as well. So, you know, in the grand scheme of things, I'd love to be able to figure out a model and know that MIA was gonna, the insurance corporation was gonna pay for the digging out, and all of those things need to be worked out. But I think that's less important than figuring out how we're gonna build it and, you know, paying for it and building it. And if there wasn't a proponent that was like, here's some money, we'd have to build it anyways, or figure out something anyways, or just sterilize the community. But even if we stop building there now, we still have people in the Cheekeye family, we have schools there. So it has to happen somehow. So those are my deep-seated concerns, and then there's more global concerns. But how we get there is going to be figuring out the economics. I would like 2 models, not just the how much does it cost to clean it out model.
The very first piece of work should be proceeded. The very first piece of work is exactly that. It's figuring out what is the detailed hazard and risk and the economic impact of course, we have an idea of one scenario. It needs a robust evaluation. What exactly is the risk? And that would provide some of those answers to those questions.
Right.
Just to expand on that, we did talk to EMBC about their risk, that they would have to pay out DFA today if there was an event, and they would presumably, we haven't done the numbers, but presumably pay a lot less out to clean up the debris if there was a barrier that was an event. So there's a very clear business case just for EMBC, never mind the rest of us, and never mind loss of life and disruption and all those things. So that's part of that conversation. Probably at the ministerial level, I think that staff at EMBC are feeling like this is a little bit out of their depth, and that the legislation is not written clearly in this, and we probably do need to go to that level.
All right. noting time, we have time for 2 more comments, questions. Councillor Pryor, then Mayor Heitzman.
Yeah, I'll keep it short. To Mayor Heinzman's point, I do think we should have some kind of strategy of how we're talking to the province to see what we can get with them and from them and the adjoining property owners, developer, and property owners there. I think working together we might have a better chance of succeeding there. And to Susan's point about the barrier has had 3 or 4 different locations over the years to protect what's there now, protect what's coming. If I understand, there's been a few different ideas of where it could go. Am I right there? Like to protect the existing, we could do something now right down near the high school. And then as we are bringing development into that area, the barrier is going farther back and getting bigger. So that's just a point, to Susan's comments. And then the list of assets that's being protected, the province has some assets in there. And so I still think that we should somehow get all of us in the room and go meet them and try and bring them into the game a bit more. That's all. Thank you.
Yeah, point, and I'll just elaborate on the point that Chris made. Interestingly, if an event happened tomorrow and the ENBC would be 100%, not 70-30, 100% they'd be responding to the emergency. And I think what we're trying to do is get to a yes on this. The report that Councillor Pryor talks about, we asked for our staff to go and see, are there other options? Mm-hmm. And the report basically said, because there's a proponent who will pay for this option is the best. It wasn't the cheapest, but might be the one we want to consider, and council decided that that's where we would explore. I think we do need to have a conversation with the province. They, as Chris articulated, the general maintenance, that I think is the irony, is that we did nothing, loss of life aside, which is really serious and why we're doing this to begin with, they would have, their risk is much higher in terms of their costs than backstopping any kind of entity here or ensuring that they're part of the maintenance and operations, because it continues to reduce their risk down the road. So that's a conversation we need to have with the province. Insurance, MI sat on the MIA board for a couple of years. MIA is just not equipped to insure this magnitude of structure, so it wouldn't be MIA, it would be Lloyd's of London or someone that has a bigger pool to be able to take the risk. It's just, it would be way too much risk for MIA, so it would be MIA that could do this. And I agree with Councillor Race. I think the insurance is ambiguous at best, and there's all sorts of, if you're 1 centimeter over that minimum allowable, it could be all written off in a second. So you just have to be really careful there. So I just may be looking for staff to, there's no actual motion with this. It was mostly to bring council up to speed on discussions with the NBC and where the developer is in terms of some of the exploration of financing options. We've been talking with Squamish Nation about visiting the minister for a number of months now, and it kind of got pushed out by their election and stuff, but we should get on that meeting ASAP. And we can sort of talk about what that strategy might be in terms of our approach with the NBC and who should be in the room in that meeting. But I just want to make sure that if there's an outcome from this discussion, make sure if there's a motion that staff needs to move forward. I'm not sure if Linda or who wants to sort of shepherd that up.
So the purpose of this meeting was to update council where we're at with the ENBC discussions, the projections, and the CAC. And the other point of check-in was that we are planning to come back with a motion later on in March, probably towards the end of March, regarding the public hearing, the scheduling of a public hearing, where we would see some of the same information. Maybe there would be something new from the NBC, but that's why there was a motion in this report. It's just an update and checking with council whether council felt it was timely to schedule another public hearing, probably for sometime in April.
Would we have to go back to second reading? And there's.
No,
there's no-
nothing has changed in terms of the zoning, other than the uses remain the same, the densities remain the same, it's just the tenure of housing is changing. So we don't have to go to second reading, but we do have to go back to public hearing because of the new information.
Yeah, Councilor Race and Councilor Elliott.
Yeah, just on that point, I just assumed that, and for me, there's two issues here. I mean, nobody's really talked a lot about the amenities, so it doesn't seem to be sort of in dispute the same way. But for me, it's the operating costs and the capital replacement issue, if you like. And they're kind of on separate paths. And so in my mind, we'd want to have a little bit of clarity on both of those before we went to public hearing again, so the public knew, maybe not to detail level, but the public had an idea of what was coming, particularly if there's a share of this costing going into general taxation. And so I was going to suggest that going forward that staff maybe divide the two issues. It might be easier to deal with it that way and come back to us with some options. I mean, as a council, I don't think we've really decided anything right now about this cost sharing thing. I mean, we've expressed the odd opinion, but we don't have 70-30s, 50-50, etc. And maybe it's better for us to just go in and kind of chew on that. But for staff to come back with some options, what is it at 70-30? What is it at 50-50, for example, with different costing levels, and see what that looks at for a decision. Because I think, for me, before we go to public hearing, I think it's important to the community to know, is it a 50-50 split, 70-30 split, and roughly what does that number look like? And then how would the district deal with it? There's the issues that were raised by Ms. Matthews, which I wasn't trying to make more work for them, but I mean, whatever is the best way to deal with it, etc. So that's one of them. The other one, with this capital cost thing, to pin down the provinces, I agree, and it's something we've talked about. We're going to have a talk with the minister, I think, and it's kind of on a separate path. But I think it's important that we get some clarity on that before the public hearing as well, to know what is the ultimate liability, because that's been a concern that's been expressed in the community that I've heard from different public meetings I've had.
Thank you, Chair. On the heels of that request from Council, staff can certainly provide more of that analysis around, and I'll work with the CFO behind the scenes to do that. Just want to let Council know it would be very speculative, as we mentioned today, in terms of not having a detailed design and bringing members forward. If we can do it, it will be, as the numbers are today, very speculative.
I don't think we're going to be able to get anything definitive from EMBC in terms of answering these questions. Or I think they're in the same position as we are. Is what we're trying to do here is shrink, manage, and understand the risk that this potentially brings to us. EMBC is in exactly the same boat. It's sort of I hesitate to say sort of chicken and egg. Is short of having the detailed design, there's really no way to make these numbers any more robust. We're just going to give you another set of numbers based on a hypothetical design. We need the detailed design to be able to say it will cost this much per annum to maintain it, it's going to cost this much to do all the work on it. And I suspect that EMBC are probably going to be in the same boat. They say, well, how much are you asking us to bring to the table? So,
Yeah, CAO and then applicant's representative.
Thank you, Chair. We can certainly still bring those numbers back in terms of the proportional split if we do general versus service area.
Yeah.
I think we're
that,
on the
sure,
same
absolutely.
page.
And if I understand correctly, that would be sort of how Councillor Rice articulated, doing the operating side and then leaving the capital side sort of up for discussion with the EMBC in the longer term. Is that
Well,
correct?
because I think it may take, first of all, pushback on the Dyking District issue. It may take pushback with the minister on the province's responsibility, also protect their assets. There's a number of provincial issues, I think, here, but I think that's different from just the operating and maintenance.
And you were suggesting that We wanted the information on the operational side before the public hearing, but not necessarily having everything sorted out with the province.
Well, ideally, I think we would. I guess we'd have to get comfortable as a council.
Yeah, because I mean, from what I understand from staff, it sounds like this EMBC and that conversation is going to take quite a bit longer and is unlikely to be resolved in the next few weeks. Would that be fair to say?
That's correct.
I'm going to go to Councillor Elliott and then Mayor Hinsman.
I wouldn't want to go to public hearing until we have another cost sharing scenario mapped out. Like, I think we need to go to the community with a preferred option of counseling. And right now, there's just a local service area tax. But I think, to me, that demonstrates that we're not creating a sustainable community. And I realize the numbers aren't baked until we have a final design, and they won't be baked until we have that final design. But I think we have to be able to go to public hearing again with council's preferred option for the operations and maintenance. So, and I think at a minimum, because we've been talking about this since the last public hearing, we need to get in front of the province with Squamish First Nation. Like, to not have a sense of where this government might lean in terms of supporting this and go back to public hearing again, I think is irresponsible. So I think we all understand that we won't know the final numbers until we have the final design, but we also need to be able to go to public hearing with at least our sense of the best possible way forward, and I don't think we've come to that yet today.
Mayor Hinsman.
Yeah, I think that was exactly what I was going to say. I think we need some things clarified for the public hearing. If the public hearing goes forward, council considers third reading, detailed engineering designs get done, and the information changes dramatically, we may have to repeal third reading and go back to public hearing. Or even go back to second reading, depending on the amplitude of the change. So that's just a scenario that, because of the complexity of this, you just have to be realistic about. The detailed design changes things dramatically from a taxation point of view, from a funding point of view, we have to, if it changes enough, we have to be able to understand that we may have to go back to public hearing and to give reconsideration of it. Depends on the conditions and.
So what I'm understanding here from the discussion is that we have to get to a decision around, are we comfortable with the public hearing dates that we've sort of set out? Does that give us the timeline that's necessary to have the information that is reasonable for council to expect from staff? Or do we need to consider alternatives? See it?
Thank you, Chair. At this point, what's planned, as I mentioned, is the agenda planner. We've got another report coming to the regular in 2 or 3 weeks, at which time, ideally, council feels they have enough information to set the public hearing date at that time,
Okay.
as opposed to setting it today.
Great. Last comment.
I just want to say that I think that we have the tools in a toolbox of how do we mitigate your financial security. And the question is, to what degree, how, which tools do we use when? Is it insurance, is it LAS, is it general taxation, is it being hedged by EMBC? And understanding what those costs actually are depending on the build out that BGC comes to, which will require designs. We do have unknown variables and we will be able to refine that, I think, based off of this conversation. But I think we're going to come to a point where we're going to have to go in with an idea that there will be uncertainty, but we'll know that if we move this number and the LIS fee, or if we modify our insurance, maybe we get comfortable here, but understanding what that financial security is. And I think to Councillor Chappelle saying that if it isn't here, there's a cost too, and understanding how do we balance it too, which I understand is very delicate. So I think it's a really robust conversation and very helpful for us as the applicant.
All right, thank you. Noting time, we're going to move on to our next item on the agenda.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'm quickly going to grab the planner.
Okay, we're going to do a 5-minute recess. All right, we're back in our Community Development Standing Committee meeting. Moving on to item 3, which is 37870 Cleveland Avenue, also known as the Plaza at Junction Park.
Good afternoon, Chair and Council. My name is Carrie Hamilton, and I'm a planner with the Community Planning and Infrastructure Department. Today I'm presenting on behalf of Asia Phillip for a third look at the 37870 Cleveland Avenue rezoning application. It's formerly called Pac West, and now for the interim called the Plaza at Junction Park. So the application submitted to rezone the former Pac West site from CD 37 to a new CD 37 zone back in March of last year. The project was previously reviewed at the September 12th CDC meeting, where 4 different massings and siting options were presented, which are shown here to help kind of revive our memories on that. And the committee gave feedback on the massing, height, and design options for the project, which the applicant took into consideration. So following this feedback, a revised proposal was presented again to this committee on November 7th. And as these plans provided more detail, further comments were received around commercial placement in the plaza areas and along Loggers Lane, open space, and street end variation. So the new proposal package is provided today for this committee's further review. This package provides extensively more form and character design detail and hopes to address all the questions and comments from previous committee reviews. And a summarized list of all the comments received from past committee meetings are found in attachment 1. I'd like to take the next few minutes to present these revised renderings and site plans while highlighting how these address each of those points. So the rendering above shows how the site will provide variation in height, shape, and massing between buildings. Given the large site and location, an entire block with 4 frontages, ADP wished to see this site become a landmark development with a unique design. They suggested a common design theme could apply across the site, but avoid the exact replication of buildings. As you can see here from the rendering, height, width, and even design detail are varied amongst all 3 prominent buildings. So consistent comments throughout the committee meetings have raised concern for the activation along Loggers Lane. The revised renderings brings commercial units all the way to Loggers Lane at 4 points along the block. 2 CRU units go further to wrap around the Loggers Lane side. The mid-block plaza was widened along the Loggers Lane side, and loading and garbage relocated. The last point I want to highlight on this rendering are the widened viewscapes between the 3 building masses. So this rendering compares the new proposal site plan with the last November 7th site plan. This also provides another visual to see the impact of relocating the loading space and garbage has had on the design and the activation of Loggers Lane. You can see that there. We heard from ADP that the ground plane was critical. Commercial or office at grade fronting all streets activates the pedestrian realm, and that the development should consider lining through block connections with commercial uses to activate these areas and establish stronger east-west pedestrian connections. Staff believe this recommendation has been achieved with this revised proposal, as you can see here. So these are renderings to highlight the mid-block plaza. The renderings to the left shows views from Studio SQ, preserving viewscapes of the Chief. The rendering to the right shows how the plaza will provide an activated mid-block connection, complete with storefronts, landscaping, large canopies, and seating. These renderings provide detailed look at the street end of Main Street in Vancouver. These were also comments that we had received. The 4-story office is now located at the Main Street, and while a large second-story residential rooftop common area is proposed for the Vancouver Street end, which will help to preserve viewscapes from the House on Brew Pub. The Vancouver end also proposes a ground floor setback at the southwest end to accommodate ground floor commercial patio space. These renderings also show how the proposal meets ADP's comments for a special treatment at both ends with regards to view, shading, design, and use. A number of comments were also made around open space and activation. The November proposal, which is below, only proposed one common roof deck, where now 2 are proposed. Council and ADP will get a chance to comment on the activation detail of these common spaces further at DP. The revised proposal also includes increased stepping back along Cleveland Avenue, which you can see by comparing the bottom November design to the revised design at the top here. Oh, and I have little arrows for both these, sorry. The old design's on the bottom. Oh, yeah, and they have flipped.
Yeah, they should be.
No, that's how they flipped it. So they now have moved
The office that way, right?
the office was on Vancouver side and it's now on the Main Street side. So finally, there were comments received around how this proposal aligns with the new downtown zoning changes. The table shows both the regular C4 zone and the High Street C4 zone requirements. So I just want to note here that this property is outside of the High Street, so I won't compare this CD 37 to the zone, but have included it here for kind of as a reminder. So this zone proposes 5% more employment space than the regular C4 zone. The C4 zone that we have does not have an FAR to compare to, but it does have a height, which is 20 meters, and the CD37 zone will offer a variation of heights from 27 meters to 15 meters, as you can see at the bottom corner there. So this proposal also provides a rendering looking south to show the massing of both this proposed building on the left and the approved DP for the main on the right. This proposal will achieve 15% more commercial space than the main development and will have a reduced FAR of 0.49, just to give some comparison. So the applicant has offered the following voluntary community amenity contribution, which is 12% affordable rental housing units, which equates to 18 units, 8% purpose-built market rental housing unit, which equates to 13 units, and 10% adaptable housing units, which equates to 15 units. And these will be built to BC Building Code adaptable housing standards. And note just that this is not considered a CAC under the district CAC policy. And the fourth one is the public plaza between Junction Park and the development property, which is on Main Street, and which would also include renovations to open up the south side of Ocean Pavilion. So here's a table to further highlight how this aligns with our CAC policy at the time of this, of reviewing this rezoning, noting that there has been a number of evolutions of our CAC policy. And this table also compares the proposed CAC to the current original zone, which had a density bonus written into the actual zone itself. So just take a little moment here to highlight this table. So if you look from the top, in the original zone, the density bonus was written inside that they are allowed to have an FAR of 1.0, and to achieve a FAR of 1.39, they would have to meet all 3 of these conditions. So one of those conditions was 7 apartments, which were supposed to be registered on a housing agreement, and they were deemed affordable. There was some percentage attached to that housing agreement, and 1 live workspace. This our CAC policy requires a minimum of 10% affordable housing. This is at the time when we reviewed this. And this application is proposing 12% affordable housing units in perpetuity, and this would result to 18 units. So the second piece is the second component of that original zone was around 1,000 meters. They would have to provide 1,000 meters of outdoor market. This was designed as surface parking lot that could be converted into a market space, such as we kind of have today. The CAC policy that we applied here was to provide active transportation or park amenities or the cash equivalent. I provided the amount of what that cash equivalent would look like here on the table, but the applicant is proposing to actually build the public plaza. And that would be, this total square footage around that plaza is, and that's just the Main Street component, not the mid-block and not the Vancouver side. Just that piece on the Main Street would be 808 meters squared, roughly around, and there would be no parking. It wouldn't be a surface parking stop. And then also wanted to show that this has an estimate of about $400,000, but minus the normal streetscape improvements that we would require with any DP that comes through.
that it's about a difference of $300,000 that they're contributing to this. Then the last piece here is the third piece that they would have to achieve was 129 meters squared of civic multi-use space for a not-for-profit society, and no secured commercial or office was written in that zone. So as it stands, there's no requirement for any commercial or office on this site. So what we, in our CAC policy, we don't have anything written around the employment space component, but this proposal is offering 25% commercial and office, which equates to just under 4,000 meters squared of commercial and office. And the last two additional amenities here are the 10% adaptable housing units and the 8% market rental housing units. So open to the chair for discussion.
Great. Mayor Heinzman and Councilor Race.
Yeah, just for clarification from staff, because when we had the conversation about the High Street, council asked many times, should we not do it all the way down to Vancouver and all the way up to Buckley? And staff said, well, it's not zoned, so we have to come back for rezoning so we can achieve the High Street goals without having to extend the boundary. So I think it is a valid conversation to compare the High Street goals with this development, because otherwise we would have just extended the boundary.
Yeah, I think also related to that is the intention behind why that High Street was designated in the downtown neighborhood plan. And I believe it did end at
It did, but council
Victoria.
kept saying about why aren't we considering it to Vancouver and why are we considering it to Buckley? And staff's rationale was we have rezoning applications so we can achieve some of those or all of those through that process. So I just don't want us to fluff over the conversation about understanding its relevance to the High Street designation.
Absolutely.
Councilor Race.
Yeah, thank you. What do you define as adaptable? When we're talking about adaptable housing, what is that? It's not a term I'm familiar with, actually.
My understanding of it, and it's quite limited, is that it allows for wider hallways and it's accessibility feachers. So they would have to meet a higher standard of the BC building code to allow for just accessibility, higher level of accessibility.
Oh, and that was the word I was looking for, was accessible. I wasn't familiar with adaptable. Thank you.
Councilor Stahl.
Thanks. I don't mind the design of it. It's got view corridors. It achieves good density with commercial, with overreaching our commercial goals with a separate, I can't hide my excitement over having another commercial space in town that's solely commercial, and the amount of public space. I think it does meet our High Street goals. I think that we basically left that block when we approved all the main, and this exceeds the main's thing. So we can't hold one block to a higher, one developer on the street at a different accountability to a developer across the street. We've already approved the main, and the main didn't give us any of these things, not view corridors, not public space, not second floor commercial. So this development actually achieves all of the goals that we've been asking for, so I definitely like it in its preliminary. I look forward to the other comments, but I can't figure out anything to pick on right now.
Okay, Councilor Pryor and then Councilor Race.
Yeah, and you know, to Patty's point on the High Street, I do think we should consider that when you're looking at this planning check. A couple of things that the advisory design panel said that wasn't brought up was some of these bigger, more complicated developments, that a drive-through should be, there should be the digital drive-through. You understand what I mean? A lot of times we get a development in an ADP and the developer's architect will drive you around that building so you can actually see it.
A 3D modeling.
3D model,
But
yeah.
drive-through, yeah. And so, I do think that this warrants that. And another thing that ADP suggested at the last meeting was models. Model, like they do sometimes in the city, and so when they do a model, they model it with adjoining buildings, just cube up the adjoining buildings. I can't help but notice there's no cross-section with the brew pub in there. And anyway, other than that, I do really think that the drive-through modeling is crucial for everyone to understand this. You know, we've got another building going up, and I somewhat think that we don't understand, and I'll speak for myself, the 8-story, what it's going to actually look like, because we don't have 8-story here. We've got 4-story, and you know, I walk by the 4-story ones now, and I look up and I go, okay, 8 stories is 4 more higher than that. And so when I go down Loggers Lane, if you go down Loggers Lane and walk right up against the buildings down there, walk where the railroad tracks are, and look up, so that's 6 stories. Gives you a little bit of an idea, but I just don't think we have scoped that yet. And that's why I think the drive-through model and a model could be, you know, helpful for everybody. And I guess it achieves the stepping back like what we were looking at, but you know, just an afternoon looking at it with the few pictures we got, I can't really say much more than that. You know, we've got the pictures, all may help. But I know Salterra on Hastings built some buildings, and Mike, you know the ones I'm talking about, or maybe it's Mike built them, but they're a little nicer than these ones.
I just wanted to clarify one point, through you, Chair, that the last page of these renderings will give you a little bit of the shadow analysis, but it also highlights where the brew pub is located, so just to show the stepping back that happens on that Vancouver side. But points noted.
It shows the brew pub in that one?
It shows the massing of the brew pub.
Well, I mean, just to show you that on that point there, it makes the brew pub look higher than this building. You know, it's amazing what you can do with your computer when you're moving buildings around. But, you know, we have a shot from Cleveland going south, we don't have a shot from Cleveland going north. You know, and we superimpose a building that's not even there. But, I mean, all in all, it's a certainly an improvement from what it was.
Okay, we have Councillor Race and then Councillor Kent.
Yeah, and I also like the changes, but just on the issue of the extension of the zoning of Cleveland Avenue, for me, that zoning was confined to a couple of blocks for 2 reasons. One was to preserve the character of a series of small lots and allow them to develop without forcing them to amalgamate in some fashion to get a bigger building and to retain that character. And the second thing was to start this step back process, which this building does, so you don't get the canyon. Even though the other side of the street's pretty vertical coming up from the street, this one does step back, and so I'm not concerned about that. It would be interesting to see it from the south, but the thing I liked about it was by confining it, and one of the results of that is height. When you shrink the footprint a little bit, at least on the second floor or above the second floor, you do get the ability to see through the development and get a sense of what's on the other side of it. And that's been important for me on the blind channel development, like Scirocco and this one, which is right next to the blind channel. So that I do like, and I think what we have to recognize is when you do that and you create a big gap in the center of the building or in two or three spots, one of the results of that to make the thing work is going to be a little bit of additional height. So I can live with that.
Okay, Councillor Kent.
Yeah, I think this is a much nicer, more refined design, and I thank the developer for listening to staff and to council on the notes that we gave you. And I like the step backs look great. The viewscape is very important. I think you really listened to us on that. The plazas, the commercial, and the wraparound on the end. And I think bearing in mind with the height issue, I think, you know, we have to realize that at some point this is really sort of a gateway piece into the oceanfront where we're going to have additional heights, possibly some even much larger ones. So all in all, I like it a lot.
That Mayor Hangster?
Yeah, generally speaking, I think it's probably ready to go to reading. I just want to be able to evaluate it to what we set in the downtown. I think it's a relevant conversation. I still have trouble getting my brain around CACs and how we equate CACs for purpose-built rental, affordable purpose-built rental, and how we equate that in the equation of the CAC. I just have trouble getting my brain around it. Because purpose-built rental still creates revenue for, and with good interest rates, they become a viable option. So whoever owns that building is still making money. And so, anyway, I just think how we equate those things within the formula of our CACs, I always find it a little challenging. I found it challenging on the Cheekeye one as well. So I think we need to figure out how to articulate that so I understand it. Maybe other people have the same problem, maybe they don't. But I think generally it's at the point where I think it should get first reading and then public process. And I do think the design, I think there's some really interesting elements in design. Yeah, and that, I mean, that's more of a DP end of things. But I think at this point we've come a long way in the policy side of things, and you can bring this on to first reading.
Have Councillor Schell and then Councillor Elliott.
I'm interested in the fact that this person, this developer put in accessible units. And do we require accessible, now that we're getting more of these sort of apartment buildings, are we asking for accessible units? And I just don't want to miss the piece of this developer has provided this, but I'm wanting it to, I think that should be a requirement.
Yes, so if I may, for you, Chair, that is a consideration whenever we have a larger rezoning application coming forward, especially downtown. So Sirocco had to make a similar commitment as this development.
So it's written in our policy that we demand, or is it just a nice ask?
When it's a rezoning, it's a requirement.
If it's rezoning, but how do we make it a requirement if it's not, if something's already zoned for density or proposed for density that doesn't have to come for rezoning? How do we ensure that there are affordable units?
We would have to change the zoning to some sort of a density bonus scheme because we're dealing with building code requirements.
Yeah.
And so we couldn't just outright require it if it was already zoned. It's kind of like a CAC, you have to negotiate it at the rezoning stage and get a commitment and put it in a land development agreement because it's not something that we can secure.
So there's no provincial legislation that has requirements for a certain amount of accessible units?
No.
I think that's something that we need to consider in the future, is some sort of policy that guarantees us, even if it's, yeah, I think that we definitely need as our population ages too, if we're considering having seniors in this housing as well, that we're going to need to have accessible units in a larger proportion of our units.
Councillor Elliott?
I agree with my colleagues that we should evaluate this against our high street zoning that we put in place. I think that's important. And also, what did ADP, they said there should be a special landmark. How did they phrase it?
It's in the attachment one, sorry, I'm just trying to find the word. Aim to create a landmark development with a unique design.
So I think that what's before us could certainly go to first reading. I think that the design currently gives us a better sense of massing and where things go in the landscapes. But when it comes back to DP, it's not a landmark unique design yet, in my opinion. And I think I agree with ADP, it should be. It's a whole block, and I think it could really stand out and be pretty special. But those are my only comments at this time.
Councillor Pratt?
Yeah, thanks. One thing that you know, to Patty's point on the CACs and all that, you know, all that, I have a hard time with that too, but I do know when we rezone, that's our chance to get some amenities. And I've tried and failed a few times, but I do think this, because of the location of this, and we've offered Main Street to the development, to add value to the development, you know, that's an extra 80 by 120 of road that's been basically given to the development for park, which really adds a lot of value. I think we should get, because the structure is there, a pedestrian overpass. And, you know, the commercial portion of this building at the north end is on Main Street, soon to be Main Park. And as Lauders Lane gets more and more busy, and I know we've got the blinking lights there, I think you need a pedestrian overpass. And I think this development could possibly afford, because the structure's there on one side, that, you know, we just have to build a tower on the other side to carry them. It's not, I mean, I know it's expensive, but it's not a huge expense. But I think that's something that's really worthwhile in that park. As the waterfront park develops, kids are going to be wanting to get from downtown over to the waterfront park. And we've got all the truck traffic in downtown with SODC developing. It's going to be a really busy street.
If I may, through you, Chair, an overpass over Loggers Lane is nowhere in our active transportation planning identified as something that will be needed eventually in the future. It would require significant area probably to ramp up to it.
An elevator and...
So it would be a significant piece of infrastructure with potentially some significant land requirements associated with it. And I'm just not sure if we will ever get to the level, do we want Loggers Lane to be kind of a, you know, a highway type of freeway where an overpass would be justified, or
it's going to be.
Or do we want to regulate traffic so that it is safe to cross the street without an overpass? But I think the point is that we don't have this identified as something that is needed in the future.
Is that an oversight?
I don't think so. I think we've identified that downtown will be growing, that the high density is an eventual form of development downtown. And with that in mind, I don't think it's an oversight.
I mean, I've seen some designs for the other end of the park where there are structures going across. Maybe that's the place to put it. The other end of the park. The restaurant is that tie into that bridge across. Well, I think you should think about it a little bit.
All right, Councillor Kent.
Two things. One is a comment, the other one's sort of a question. To Ted's point about the CAD, 360 CAD, I think if when we go to first reading and to the public, into the public domain, it might behoove you to have, it might behoove you to have a 360 CAD that you can show people, so to sort of take some of the rub away. People, if they want to be able to see how it's going to fit into the neighborhood, to be able to spin it around and show them that, I think it might help your cause. The other question was there a proviso on this for car share at all? Can we speak to that?
I don't believe there's I think the proposal meets our parking standards, and it's, if you look at our CAC policy before and what's coming forward, you know, it's affordable housing and then park amenities. So it hasn't been considered.
Throwing it out. Thank you.
Okay, you got Councillor Race and Councillor Pryor.
Yeah, going back to the CACs, because this is entirely, apart from that small piece of park, this is entirely provided by housing. And so I always, when I look at these and the last one and others, wonder how that gets valued. Excuse me. So typically we come up with, based on the previous interim policy, I understand that, but you go past, make the calculation so much a square foot, and you get a number, and then how are we satisfying, or how is the developer meeting that number? And there's something attributed to these housing units. Market housing, I don't think anything, but affordable housing at sub-market, there's something in there. But it depends, to me, whether we get them and we end up owning them, or whether the developer's going to run it and just get reduced rent, or sell it and just get a smaller price because of a reduced cash flow. But we haven't seen that here, and I understand there's existing zoning. So typically, if we applied our policy to it, we're dealing with the difference, the increase in square footage. However, the existing zoning, which was actually in the term before I got on council, so I'm not really intimately familiar with it. I'm not sure if there was an amenity package associated with that, because I would expect it hasn't been met yet because the building hasn't been built. So are we starting off kind of at the ground zero, calculate the square footage, and then apply how we're meeting that square footage? Because I think that, for me, that's important, because this housing thing, you can value it quite a few different ways, and I'm not sure that I've seen consistency in doing that. So I'd be interested in that calculation. And the information, I agree it can go to first reading, and we can deal with this between first and second reading if we have to. But how we get to the so much per square foot, and what happened with the first development that didn't go ahead, or the first approval, does that, do we start off just a grade now, or are we just dealing with the difference? So, and you may not be able to answer that right now.
I can take on some of that. So from my understanding, just you did pose a question in there for your chair, that was there another amenity package? And so from my understanding, the amenities for this original zone were written into the zone, and they're the three that are right there. So you can, it's written as a density bonus, but that was also, I think, the expected route that they would take, because the site plans that were attached to it were achieving those, that density, and we're achieving those three objectives. So I believe that was what was agreed to at the time. And further to the policy components, do you want to speak to some
I
of
can
those?
speak to the policy. So the policy that is moving through the consideration process right now does have a cash value for associated with multifamily development as a target calculation, but it also has the option that you either do cash or you do units on site. And that's the 10% of all units have to be affordable housing. And so it's A or B. So, you know, in some cases, we've applied both, where it's a housing contribution and cash value, but then usually the housing contribution is smaller. What we want to get is affordable housing units on the ground. And our policy does not talk whether it's, and Karen, correct me if I'm wrong, whether it's owned by a private property owner or it's owned by the district. I think in some ways it's easier if it's owned by the developer, as long as it stays as one group of units. We monitor it on an annual basis, so there's going to be reporting requirements. It's secured through a housing agreement. So from a user's perspective, it's affordable housing, no matter who owns it. But it's, so in case, I guess what I'm saying in this case is we may not need to have to make that calculation of what the value of it is, because our policy says 10% of all housing units. And if you can provide that, then there's no cash exchange.
Well, I think you've touched on something that's a bit of a gap in that policy, because my understanding of that, the 10%, was always that would be non-market housing units assumed by a non-profit authority or something where the revenue is flowing back in. And because I would agree that, as Councillor Reyes pointed out, the valuation is actually quite different depending on who gets to capture the revenue at the end of the day. And it may be our position that if it's 10% and district gets the revenue, then that's fine. Or if the developer wants to keep the revenue, then I would expect that it'd be higher than the 10% of units proposal, because the value is quite different because of who's actually capturing the revenue. So I think that that's something that we really do need to get a handle on. And we had in the past always just relied on the cash in lieu that was very clear where it was going into affordable housing reserve. But in this case, it's a little bit more murky. And okay, I have staff on this.
Sorry, so just on that note, in terms of another way of evaluating this is the straight cash in lieu on this under the draft policy that you saw a few weeks ago is 2.4 million. Affordable units, we get 18. We're getting 18 units for 2.4 million.
We get
We're getting 18, no, we are getting 18 perpetually affordable units. It doesn't matter who owns them. There are 18 units that people can live in at an affordable rate for $2.4 million, which is the cash equivalent. If we were to pure cash in lieu on this, so if we took cash in lieu, we'd have $2.4 million, and I don't think we could convert that to 18 units, regardless of who owns it.
I don't know about that. I think that our experience has been that, you know, for example, if we're looking at the nonprofit housing that we're considering in Buckley, usually in those circumstances, the other levels of government will chip in some money and we put in, you know, our share, 10%, 20%, get the project up and going, and then we're going to get 40 or 50 units. And so, to me, it's a different philosophy, and I think we need a little bit of both, but they need to be evaluated. And I think maybe this conversation extends a little bit more beyond this particular development, and we should probably revisit it when we talk about the CAC policy in the next iteration, or not the next iteration, but the revised one. So, and I have some other folks on, but I'm just going to jump on to what Councillor Pryor was saying. I think he makes a good point around we should actually really consider what we might do with that crossing, because it is going to be a higher volume crossing once that plaza is put in place. And whether that's an overpass, I don't know, maybe from a design perspective and from, you know, an engineering perspective, some other interventions would be more appropriate. But I'm thinking that, you know, in tandem with this development, it's a very good opportunity for us to secure some contribution to really improve that crossing. Because right now, if I'm not mistaken, I believe the Main Street crossing, there's not even any other pedestrian activities in there, or are there? But to have, you know, other interventions around, you know, tightening up the curbs and maybe an elevated crosswalk, you know, like we did near the Adventure Center and something like that. Because we will, I think with the closure of that section of Main Street, that it will be sort of a natural crossing point for pedestrians in that area. So something to consider. But okay, I have Councillor Pryor, and then I have Councillor Schwab.
Well, just, it's on the affordable housing, and I know from what Jason said, we'll talk about this later, but affordable housing is what percentage of your income?
Our policy defines it as 30% of your household income, and that would include any heating costs, so any housing costs that would be associated with that amount.
Whose household income?
Average household income in the district.
So that's what, 60,000?
No, it's more than that. It's in the 80,000 range.
So whatever someone making 80,000 a year can afford, that's what our affordable housing, that's the units we're getting.
It would range between 80% from that. So here's the average. So our range for that 30% is between 80 and 120%.
I think it's the median.
Or median,
But I
yes.
just wonder if you could bring a number to that sometime, so that you could tell me what the rent's gonna be. I mean, how much is it, so I mean, just so I know what the number is.
We can clarify that.
A lot of people aren't in that, you know, they know it's our medium income, but I don't think we're really getting affordable housing. We're getting housing for a workforce possibly that somebody might pay for, but it's not necessarily affordable housing.
Councillor Schwab.
Thanks. I agree with Gary on this. I think that right now we don't have the means to actually run any housing. In Vancouver, it's run by the City of Vancouver actually gave up managing the housing units. Now the housing units are managed by the proponents that put forward affordable housing. They have the means to do it. They maintain the units, and that expense isn't incurred by the district. So to take in units, we'd never be able to build 18 affordable housing units. And even the units that we're building on Buckley Street are going to be median income housing as well. And we won't have a mortgage on these, and most importantly, I think this is a great way to actually get affordable housing units, and it's above the amount that we asked to actually get 18 units that we don't have to manage, that will be managed by another group until we have a housing authority that we can put things into and have an actual way to manage our housing and a way to clearly understand. Just taking in cash in lieu doesn't pay for anything, and we don't have the land. We've already got a project on Buckley, that's great, but we currently don't have any more land to leverage. And we need mixed income density now with multiple ranges of income in one place. So we need to take in as many units in these larger developments as possible, and not just get dribblings of cash that may go to somebody else's income, which is, or another contractor, and not actually create affordable housing. I think this is a better way to do it, everywhere.
Any other comments or questions? Steph?
I'd just like to speak to a consistent comment that came up around comparing it to the high street. So potentially taking this opportunity to discuss that a little further, because I kind of breezed over it. So I just wanted to highlight here that this CD 37 zone, the proposal is for 25%, which is matching one of the options for the high street. The other one is it's in between there's 3 FARs, and these are all for, large lots. So this would be considered a large lot in those, if you can kind of remember those 3D models that we had and the different options. So this, the 1.5 FAR is what you can get with 25%, 1.75 is for 30% commercial, and 2.5 is for 100% commercial. But just this number here on the side, the 2.20, that includes the commercial, it includes all of the different type of rental units. If we look at just the market residential units, that FAR is 1.38. So just to kind of give you some comparison to that, and then there's a number of market rental and affordable rentals that are also proposed in this package. So that may, we don't have anything written in the High Street C4 zone, but we don't actually have any affordable housing or rental density bonuses written in those C4 zones, and we're considering those bonuses as well as giving a density bonus to achieve that 2.2. And then also just to highlight that the 20 meters is the same in the C4 zone for High Street and for the regular C4 zone. And the one variation. Yeah.
Yeah, so just so I can understand, and I like the fact that we go to FAR, so we get some variation in design of the building and all that sort of thing. And this has everything from greater setbacks, 2-story plaza areas or shared areas, as well as 6- and 8-story forms, and I guess 4-story forms as well. So how would we fairly compare it if we were just to say the FAR is 2.0? What would be the average stories? Because you've got a variation there. So I'm trying to compare apples to apples. So how would we?
Well, here's the comparison through your chair. There's a comparison that I provided with this slide, and that's to Main Street, which was 6 stories. It didn't provide any of those open spaces as this committee had observed and mentioned, and it was pretty much a large rectangle filling up the lot. That achieved an FAR of 2.69, and this one will achieve something less of that.
That doesn't help me.
That doesn't help? Okay.
I'm trying to understand is if there was would this be under the 20-meter height if it was averaged?
We can run that analysis for the first reading.
Just so we understand so people understand FAR in terms of reducing mass here, allowing for more open space here, and that variable, as opposed to what would a 4-story or 6-story building that met that FAR look like without that height of the 8 stories. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Councilor Elliott.
And I think for me, the other piece of this is just that articulated street front that we talked about on the High Street, and also that angle in terms of stepping back buildings and how it compares to that.
So through you, Chair, we're trying to get numbers, and we'll hopefully have some numbers to present to give a comparison for that actual step back. We have some visuals and some renderings to show it, but we'd like to show it in comparison to that. But the intention is that we're trying to maintain a very similar kind of step back or view with especially those visibility pieces that will allow for sunlight to come in and viewscapes to be seen.
All right. I think that covers it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, we'll move on to our last item of the agenda. Development project update.
Thank you, Chair. So we've got the monthly update. There are, as you can see, 6 new projects since we last met that are development specific. And I've highlighted a few projects in here. One is the second project on the list, 2018-15. That's a project proposed for rezoning from I-1 to C4 on Main Street. It's for a mixed-use development with ground floor and mezzanine level of employment space and 16 units of residential mix. The proposal includes 50% market rental, which would meet our policy, our draft policy that's coming forward tonight for priority development applications. So just in case the policy doesn't go through tonight, I wanted to check in with council to make sure that we can expedite this proposal as we did with a few others, even though the policy hasn't been adopted yet.
Kitty corner from the library.
Yes. So this would meet our threshold for 50% rental.
Sounds like nobody has any objections.
Okay. So we're getting close to that. I think this would be project number 4. That's in the expedited route. And I think the draft policy allows for 5 projects. And then the other item that I highlighted was the last of the new applications. It's 3 properties on Wilson Crescent. It's a rezoning from RM1 to RM2 to accommodate a higher density for approximately 24 townhouse units. This area on Wilson Crescent has got a number of large lots, and they're all zoned for multiple family residential, but a lot of them are still in the single family state. It's a potentially fast growing area, and I think that before we process rezoning applications in here, we should really the district should come up with a small neighborhood plan. So my recommendation to council would be for staff to work with this property owner or potential property owner, and we know there's other interests in the area, and suggest to them that they would fund the district taking on the work for a small neighborhood plan before going through these rezonings, just to make sure that we don't have these isolated developments next to each other that are all going to be, in a townhouse kind of form.
So if I read correctly, the properties though in particular that are mentioned here, they're actually still zoned R1?
Yeah, I think they're zoned RM1. This might be a typo.
Oh, is that a typo?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I can tell you, RM1.
It is RM1, okay, I'm just confused by that. Okay, Councilor
So
Pryor.
just in the Wilson, so when you said the neighborhood area, that would be the loop?
Yes.
good idea.
Chappelle.
Yeah, I was going to say that, I really appreciate you bringing that up, Louis. I think that that whole area lacks sidewalks and walkability, and if we continue to rezone into multifamily in that area, we're gonna get little pods that all can't walk and can barely walk around their neighborhoods with the high density in there. Never mind how we're gonna connect that area and the school there as well with the traffic. I think it really deserves a neighborhood plan, so thank you for bringing that up, appreciate it.
And a potential through-block walkway.
Yeah.
Exactly, I think there's a
No,
lot of park type of connection and greenway connections that could be established if we look at it holistically rather than a one-on-one.
And my other remark would be that also kind of maybe sending the signal to potential developers that, you know, they may not want to try and load us up with variances in this area essentially. Because that seems to be a recurring theme, and I think that of all the neighborhoods in Squamish, this is the one that can least handle that kind of variance. But anyway, that's just my opinion. Councillor Kent.
Thank you. Looking at the top item, the 2018-16, 38931 Queensway, that's right beside the A-frame.
That's right.
Adjacent to that, the Sabre site, I noticed has a DP up, and they were doing some site alteration in there today. But I don't see that anywhere on the list.
It may be, so this list only has active applications. If it's been issued or approved, then it wouldn't be here. I would suspect that's what's happening.
Okay.
I believe there might have been a delegated.
Just curious, because I drove by there today and they had equipment in there and they were working on the Sabre site.
I believe it was, if my recollection is correct, it was a TUP and it wasn't a temporary building.
I didn't stop to look at the DP, I was driving past, but I was just curious because they were actively working on it.
We can look into that.
Councillor Elliott.
I don't have any questions about the development, but in terms of the list, depending on how the discussion goes tonight about prioritization, could we put those priority projects always at the top so we don't lose sight of them with staff?
Absolutely.
And also, I know you always add the ones in green, but can we add a column that just says the date they either became an active development or landed on this list for us?
Application date for all of the applications?
Starting, going forward, not going backwards.
Okay.
Going forwards. I don't want you to do that, but I don't think the pace is going to slow down in the near term, and it's just, as a counselor, to see, you know, that some of these don't move forward because of the applicant, and others because they're complicated, but it's handy to just have that time reference.
You have the years, but not the activities.
Yeah. And then just keeping those ones that we're putting through the prioritization scheme at the top and leaving them there, so we don't lose them.
Could I suggest, what if we just assign a different color to them? It'd be, from a list management perspective,
Sure.
easier for us to generate it that way?
Okay, just something so that we all know which ones are the priority ones.
Okay, Councillor Cryer.
Well, on that note, when we were talking about the affordable housing, I thought it'd be good to track the amount of those, the number. Whether we could just get that on a little side note, how many affordable housing rentals, you know, are we getting?
That's probably best tracked through us. We have a spreadsheet on CAC contributions.
Yes.
That is tracked in a separate location.
You have units. Can't you just think another column saying affordable units?
There is a point where the list gets too
Yeah.
complex
Well,
to all fit it on one page.
Wherever we track those, I think it would be, you know, like I was talking to someone yesterday about affordable, you know, like, oh, we've got no affordable housing, we got no, and I go, well, actually, we've got, and then I'm trying to think of a number, 100? We might even have more than 100 coming.
So-
And I thought of the one near the railroad tracks at the North Yards there, there's 50 right there, and so I thought, well, we've got more than 100, you know, just that number would be good. And also, when we were talking about our CACs, at some point, we might want to say, we don't want any more, we want money going into our new ice rink, or the new Granite Park, or we might want to start diverting some of that money elsewhere.
So my question to staff on that would be, is it readily available to just, for you to print out a copy of your CAC tracking sheet? Does it exist? Yeah?
It does. Yes, it does. Does it need updating? Yes. So
we'll look forward to receiving that when staff is able to manage.
Okay.
But I think that's probably better just as a standalone document, and I think probably other members of council would be interested in various parts of CACs, and so if we just have a list for the monthly CUC meeting, then that might be useful.
I think that's a good idea because this only shows the active application. So once the application is out of the door, it doesn't mean that it's getting built or anything like that. You know, there may be a lull in between. So it doesn't give you an accurate picture of what's in the pipeline.
All right, council, any other questions or comments? Everybody's looking through our lists.
Eunice, you said there was 4 in the priority list. Can you just go over them again?
Yes, so we have now 2 in the business park in the Mud 1 zone. There's the Target site, which is proposing their first building to be all purpose-built rental. And actually the site next to the Target site, a smaller site, is now proposing all purpose-built rental. And that one, both of those are probably going to be coming to council for a DP fairly soon. Then we have the project on Main Street, and there's another one.
The passive house one.
Yes, on Aspen Road, there's a project on Aspen Road. And this doesn't include other projects that are also priorities, like the Buckley project, or, you know, under one roof. These are just private developments.
Just a question for one of our constituents who was asking yesterday, if somebody's been putting out some feelers up by Hospital Hill on some lot assembly up there. I wondered if you'd heard anything about that or not.
Yes, so we haven't been approached, as far as we know, about any changes in the land use or zoning up there, but anything other than residential would have to go for a zoning change. We haven't had any pre-applications or a pre-application request either.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, speak now or hold your peace for a month. All right, thanks, Jonas.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, I'll entertain a motion to terminate. Moved by Councillor Pryor, seconded by Councillor Race. All those in favor, opposed, motion carries.